give us ideas to make that possible. So that was the impossible task that I gave the two of them. And I am really looking forward to hearing what they have to say. So without further ado, I have the thumbs up from our technicians, and I believe that Jason is ready to join us on the screen. There is Jason. Well, warm welcome, Jason. I hope you can see us. I've just welcomed you and Emilia and explained a little bit the task and the context and the background about what I asked both of you to speak about. So I'd ask you, Jason, to take it away. Go ahead. And a warm welcome.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much for the really warm and kind introduction. I'm very sorry that I can't be with you today in person. We live in urgent times, and I know that to communicate urgency and to mobilize around it requires personal connection. So I'm just going to have to hope that my words will somehow be enough, but let's see. Let me begin with a simple observation. Things are not going well. Inequality continues to rise. Extreme poverty and hunger have worsened over the past several years, and our ruling classes are failing to stop climate breakdown. The failure is mind-boggling. We know that to stay under 1.5 degrees, global emissions must be cut in half by 2030. But existing government pledges are nowhere near this target. Most people are not aware of these facts, but even if all countries uphold their pledges, global emissions will not decline at all over the coming decade. And pledges are easy to make. What counts is actual policies. And right now, according to the IPCC, existing policies have us on track for around 3.2 degrees of heating. This should be an outrage to all of us. What does such a world even look like? Climate models tell us that in a 3-degree scenario, some 30 to 50% of species on this planet could be wiped out. 5 billion human beings could be displaced from their home regions by climate impacts. Yields of staple crops are projected to decline, triggering sustained food supply disruptions globally. Such a world is not compatible with organized global civilization as we know it. And climate change is not the only crisis that we face. We're now overshooting 5 other planetary boundaries as well. Dangerous rates of deforestation and land system change, dangerous rates of industrial water extraction, dangerous rates of pollution from synthetic chemicals, dangerous rates of industrial fertilizer use, and most importantly, dangerous rates of biodiversity loss. It's not your fault. It's not our fault. We tend to talk about this crisis in the language of the Anthropocene, a crisis caused by humans, but this is not correct. It's not humans as such that are causing this problem. It's being caused by a specific economic system, namely capitalism. And to highlight this fact, scholars increasingly refer to the ecological crisis with terms such as the Capitalocene. Now, it's important to be very clear about what capitalism is. When people think of capitalism, they often think of things like markets and trade, a generic system of production and exchange. But markets and trade and exchange existed for thousands of years before capitalism and are obviously innocent enough on their own. So what distinguishes capitalism from other economic systems? 2 things. First, capitalism is organized around and dependent on perpetual expansion, exponentially increasing levels of industrial production, which we euphemistically refer to as growth. If production does not increase every year, the economy spirals into crisis. It's the first and only intrinsically expansionary economic system in history, and it's deeply unstable. And remember, growth in this system is not just plucked out of thin air. It's a process of material transformation, and it is tightly coupled to both resource use and energy use. Second, under capitalism, the purpose of increasing production is not primarily to meet human needs, say for things like housing and healthcare and so on. No, this is no ordinary human economy. Rather, the explicit purpose is to extract and accumulate an ever-increasing quantity of profit. That is the overriding objective. And toward this end, capital seeks to cheapen inputs, to cheapen labor and nature as much as possible. by attacking workers' rights and wages, and by attacking environmental protections. This happens within the global north economies, where most major corporate firms are headquartered, but the cheapening is imposed even more forcefully on the global south. Northern economies rely utterly on resources and labor from the south. To maintain them at the cheapest possible price, northern states and firms leverage their geopolitical and commercial power and their monopoly control over the institutions of global economic governance to squeeze southern producers and push southern wages to the level of subsistence. This allows them to siphon a massive net flow of embodied resources and labor out of the South, worth more than $10 trillion per year. The wealth drained from the South every year would be enough to ensure that the entire population of that region has access to universal healthcare, housing, education, heating, cooling, transit, nutritious food, mobile phones, electricity, and water, but instead, it is appropriated by northern firms. It should come as zero surprise, therefore, that such a system produces inequality, both within nations and between them, perpetuates deprivation, and drives ecological breakdown. And this process of expansion and accumulation has no endpoints, right? Indeed, the dominant assumption in economics is that growth along these lines should carry on indefinitely, that every industry, every sector, every national economy should continue to increase production, regardless of whether or not we actually need it. As a result, we're in this completely bizarre, nightmarish situation where the world economy has extraordinary productive capacity and massively overuses resources and energy. And yet much of the world's population cannot even make basic ends meet, cannot meet their own basic needs. They cannot access nutritious food. They cannot access healthcare. They cannot access decent housing. And by the way, it's not like these people are somehow outside of the capitalist system, waiting to be rescued by it. No, they are central to it. They are the ones that provide the labor and the resources on which this juggernaut of elite accumulation feeds. So why does this happen? It happens because the economic system is profoundly undemocratic. Think about this. Under capitalism, decisions about what to produce, how to use resources and labor, and who benefits from the surplus that we collectively generate, all of this is controlled by an extremely small number of wealthy individuals, the 1% who own the majority of corporate shares and who are the directors of firms. And of course, what they do is they decide that they should produce things that maximize their profits and their power. Things like advertising and SUVs and cruise ships and fossil fuels, rather than things like public healthcare and public housing and nutritious food. Our economy overuses resources and nonetheless fails to meet basic human needs because it is structured in a way that is closer to feudalism than anything resembling democracy. Okay, so we care about stopping ecological breakdown. We care about reducing inequality and poverty. We want to campaign on these things, but we've been doing this for decades to extremely little effect. Why? Because our economic system, by its very logic, continues to produce these problems. It's not a bug, it's a feature. We cannot fix these problems within the existing system, and the sooner we realize this fact and have the courage to talk about it, the better our chances of survival. In my work, I argue that we can and must build a different economy, a democratic, post-capitalist, eco-social economy. An economy that is organized around human needs and ecological stability, rather than around perpetual growth and capital accumulation. Research in ecological economics over the past several years has demonstrated empirically that it is possible for us to meet human needs at a high standard for 10 billion people on this planet with significantly less energy and resources than we presently use, and significantly less aggregate commodity production. We can reduce energy and decarbonize fast enough to keep global warming under 1.5 degrees. And we can reduce resource use and reverse biodiversity loss. And we can do these things while improving people's lives at the same time. This is extremely hopeful news, a powerful antidote to the despair and doomerism and eco-fascism that plagues our society. But to get there, we have to transition out of capitalism. So what will that take? First, We need a program of universal basic services, universal public services, high quality, universal public services. Not just healthcare and education. I mean also guaranteed access to affordable housing, public transit, clean energy, internet, nutritious food, to ensure that everyone has the resources they need to live decent lives. Decommodify the means of survival. The evidence is overwhelming that public services are the single most important driver of improvements in social outcomes, and they are highly efficient at meeting needs with low levels of resource and energy use. Second, establish a green public job guarantee. Such a program would ensure that anyone who wants to can train to participate in the most important collective projects of our generation: building renewable energy capacity, insulating homes, producing local food, regenerating ecosystems. We need a massive mobilization to accomplish our social and ecological goals, and it will not happen on its own. The job guarantee provides the mechanism, and it allows us to permanently end unemployment and ensure access to dignified, socially necessary work for all at a living wage determined by the needs of local communities. How do you pay for these things? You do it with a public currency that every sovereign state controls. Taking this approach means, quite simply, shifting some of the power over our resources and labor away from corporations and plutocrats to be used instead to achieve democratically ratified social goals. These two measures alone would transform the economy. They would ensure that our common resources and our common collective labor are mobilized around producing to meet human needs first and foremost. And they would dramatically improve the bargaining power of the working class communities, reducing inequality and making capital accumulation by elites increasingly difficult to achieve. These measures would also break the existing political logjam on climate policy. Right now, our governments cannot bring themselves to introduce even the most modest, basic climate measures for fear that it may negatively impact jobs and livelihoods. But with the job guarantee and universal public services, we take the question of jobs and livelihoods off the table entirely. This frees us to talk about radical climate policy without worrying about anyone getting hurt. This is the bread and butter of a just transition. Third, we need to tax the rich out of existence. Thomas Piketty has pointed out that cutting the purchasing power of the very rich is the single most powerful way to reduce excess energy and emissions. This may sound radical, but think about it. It is irrational and dangerous to continue to support an over-consuming class in the middle of a climate and ecological emergency. How can we do this? One approach would be to introduce a wealth tax. Make it tough enough that rich people will be incentivized to sell off their extra houses and their extra assets. We can also introduce a maximum income policy, such that anything over a certain threshold or a certain wage ratio faces a 100% rate of tax. In addition to cutting excess consumption at the top, this approach will immediately reduce emissions, immediately reduce inequality, will help keep inflation under control, and will eliminate the oligarchic power that pollutes and corrupts our politics. Fourth, we need real climate policy, not the vague blah, blah, blah about net zero at some distant points in the future. No, the necessary action is blindingly obvious to everyone. Cap fossil fuel production and scale it down on a binding annual schedule until the industry is mostly dismantled by the middle of the century. Let me say that again. Cap fossil fuel production and scale it down on a binding annual schedule. This is the only fail-safe way to stop climate breakdown. And it is absolutely wild that it is not part of our discourse and not part of our policy. The rich countries must take the lead with rapid reductions to give poorer countries more time to transition. This is basic climate justice. In rich countries, this means cutting fossil fuels by 10% per year. Think about this, right? To make this possible without an energy gap, we need to scale up renewables at a rapid pace, while at the same time actively scaling down less necessary forms of production, right? As degrowth scholarship proposes, forms of production that are organized around corporate profits and elite accumulation rather than around human needs. Now, of course, it's highly unlikely that any governments will attempt to do this on their own for fear of disadvantage. A few progressive countries might do it, and this would light the path ahead. but ultimately we need coordinated international action under the banner of a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. For example, like the one that was launched earlier this year. We know that the only way to get governments to reduce nuclear weapons is for everyone to agree to do it together. So too with fossil fuels. And getting the European Union on board with this is of singular importance. You all are uniquely positioned to make this happen. Finally, we need a strong commitment on climate reparations. Rich economies and the firms that dominate them have colonized the atmosphere for their own enrichment, while inflicting the majority of the costs and damages onto the global south. This is an act of theft. Theft of the atmospheric commons on which we all rely, and it needs to be repaired. We need to support our sisters and brothers in the south who already bear the overwhelming brunt of the catastrophe that they have done little or nothing to create. This should include a policy of debt cancellation to liberate governments to use their resources for social objectives rather than to continue to service the profits of big banks. And renewable technologies should be transferred for free to countries that cannot easily afford them, with patent waivers wherever necessary to facilitate the fastest possible global energy transition. What would such a world look like? Our cynicism and fear would melt into hope and solidarity. We would feel the camaraderie of being part of something big, something transformative, something together. There would be a lot less needless commodity production and a lot fewer bullshit jobs. Our society would be more equal, and poverty would be a thing of the past. Our economy would be organized around human needs and resilience rather than around endless capital accumulation. And most importantly, emissions would fall fast, year after year. Our planet would begin to heal. We know the steps that we need to take, but we must be clear, none of this will happen on its own. It will require an extraordinary struggle against those who benefit so prodigiously from the status quo. And that's okay. So is every movement that has ever changed the world, from the civil rights movements to the anti-colonial movements. These things don't just happen. It requires doing the hard work of community organizing, building solidarities door to door, building alliances. And let me emphasize this point. The environmentalist movement cannot do this alone. And this is true for two reasons. First, it does not have a sufficiently radical analysis. In most cases, it continues to think of the problem as having to do primarily with individual behavior, rather than the structure of the economic system. Second, it does not have the political power that is required. Extinction Rebellion and Fridays for Future may be able to block bridges in central London, but they do not have the capacity to pull off a general strike. And that is the kind of power that we need. To build this kind of power, we need the labor movements and the unions. And this requires a shift in union objectives. Most unions have a tendency to align with the interests of capital in demanding more corporate growth, because they believe this is the only way to improve wages and employment. Instead, we need to solve the problem directly. Demand the public job guarantee, demand universal basic services, demand living wages, to de-link livelihoods from corporate growth entirely. We also need to build alliances with social movements in the global south. They are the ones with the real skin in the game, and their analysis is much sharper and much more radical than anything in the mainstream northern climate discourse. I urge you all to read the People's Agreement of Cochabamba, signed by thousands of social movements from across the South. It is the single most powerful climate manifesto that has yet been written. It recognizes that climate breakdown is being driven by capitalism, that it is playing out along colonial lines, and that it requires an anti-colonial struggle in response. We need to unite with this struggle. This decade is the linchpin of history. We cannot just carry on with the status quo and hope for the best. The ruling class clearly has no intention of taking the necessary steps. We have to build a movement that is strong enough to capture political power where possible, or otherwise force incumbents to change course. This will require a fight for our lives, a fight for life itself. We have everything to lose and the world to win. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jason. I mean, you've taken us from the roots, and I definitely have noted one of the root causes that you have laid out so eloquently. Capitalism, I think that's something that we all, in various aspects and manifestations, are addressing in every aspect. But I think you've laid out the root causes and the consequences of capitalism really very, very clearly. I think the 5-point or the 6-point recommendations or plan around public services, about the green job guarantee, about capital controls, giving back the power over the currency to countries, particularly in the global south, taxing the rich, a non-proliferation treaty on fossil fuels, uniting our struggles, absolutely. I look forward to Emilia's thoughts about what Jason has spoken about, as well as your own experiences and what you would like to bring to the table. Go ahead, Emilia. Thank you very much, Jason.
Hi, thank you very much. Thank you, Jason, for that amazing presentation. And hello, everybody. First, I want to say we made it. We're here in person, and it's amazing, and I don't want to give it for granted. So it's like a party. If I were standing, I would dance cumbia with all of you just to celebrate. Is really, really fantastic. But then the pandemic is not over, you know, and we're here because there is a genocide in the global south, especially in Africa, because only 17% of the people in Africa gets vaccines. And the responsibles of that genocide are your governments in the global north. So my first goal is about citizenship. And citizenship, I think we have a misconception about what social movements are, and those are detached from the exercise of citizens. And so I've been hearing, you know, because this room is full of technical people. And technical people think that the movements are out there in the streets, so we need to get in touch with people in the streets, because you don't think, one, that you're part of a movement, you're technicians and you're in the desk, but second, you don't take yourselves as citizens. And that is an exercise that I want to invite you all. So I'm sorry to say I'm not going to be very inspiring today. And I also don't want to talk about to people in the global south here. I'm sorry, you made it all this far, so I'm not gonna be addressing my message to you. I'm gonna talk to people in the global north here, because you know, a month ago I was here in Europe, and I was told that I'm too loud, that we're in the global south, we're too loud. And I was told, but we have a different style, you know, we have a different style. And well, first of all, my style is way cooler than your style, you know, but second, your style is very inefficient. It's very inefficient. So you don't need to dye your hair pink and wear very ridiculous clothes. You need to rethink what you're doing, because you are citizens of the mass murderers of the global south first, and of the environment the second. And I think you are not aware that, I mean, that the end is coming. I feel like a horse person of the apocalypse is now, because I'm just announcing the end of the world wherever I am, and people is not reacting. It's like, what else do you need? It's not only about climate change. Jason Hickel says it very clearly in Less is More. There are at least 9 elements of the planetary boundaries that we are going over by now, at least 4. It's not only climate change, it's biodiversity loss, it's ocean acidification, which we are nearly over there, of course, climate change, and many, many others. And so the world is really at stake. And in the past months, scientists are talking about the apocalypse papers. I don't know if you've heard about them, because the media is not talking about them. And it's precisely about all of these terrorific announcements that scientists in every field are saying about how we are extinguishing life and ecosystems. And, you know, scientists are doing their share, environmentalists are doing their share, what is the economic justice movement doing? And I just want to tell you that I got a phone call by Fridays from for Futures like some months ago, because they're in the streets. They're sitting outside in the streets and taking the streets. And they had a phone call with me because they wanted to understand what are the macroeconomic roots of the environmental problems. Because they said, when we meet the decision makers, we want to understand and send the right message. So there was a 5-year-old girl, and that she was the younger, up to 12-year-old young men, and they were all asking questions. Even the 5-year-old girl was asking questions because they really wanted to understand, to send the proper message to decision makers. So you all here, you don't need to take the streets to talk to those people, and you don't need to take the streets to understand the origins of this system, this capitalistic system that is making this crisis. You have both, and you have been very inefficient in acting. So how many papers do we need? Do we really need? But I just really want to say that this is really urgent and is really dire. And we need to engage with the environmental movement because they don't know what you know. They're asking for green conditionalities and $100 billion in the UNFCCC, which is like peanuts. It's like, keep them, please keep them. Let's talk about the real thing. And you know what are the real things. And you're sitting in your desk. And let me tell you something. I disagree with the Global South saving the world. First of all, we're fed up. We're tired. We've been putting the bodies. We've been going to jail. Stop it. We want you to go to jail. Go to jail. You change yourself outside the trees and the legislative bodies. You put the bodies. Put the bodies there, not us. And you want the people in the street to put the bodies? Is that what you want? Is that what you want to mobilize? Or are you going to keep on doing campaigns? It's like, you know what you do, people in the Global North. You want the Global South people to do what they do. So it's like, I'm going to give them money in their territories to do what they do, or I'm going to pay them to come here to our meetings to do what they do. What are you doing? What are you doing? Are you confronting the IFIs? Because I just want to say I'm extremely disappointed. Every time something really bad comes out with the IFIs, even the Secretary General with the OCA, I see all those letters of, we are welcoming the OCA, we are welcoming, but we have suggestions. Stop welcoming. They're destroying the planet. UN Women just partnered with BlackRock, and we know this last week. Are you expecting the feminist movement to say something that relates to us all? Are we asking for the Secretary General to resign because he's giving away the UN? What are we doing? And this is about styles. It's like you really want people in the Global South to put the bodies there. It's outrageous. You need to mobilize, you need to strategize, and you need to understand that some scientists are even saying the extinction of humankind is coming in 2040. 2040. Do you hear? It's like how much information do we need? And it's about mobilizing the Global North, the responsibilities in the Global North, the Global South. Even if we manage to get all of the left-wing parties rising up, we're gonna get to the WTO, we're gonna get to any assembly, we're gonna get our asses kicked out because it's your government. You need to break the position of the EU. You need to break the position of Australia, of the US, of Japan. And I was telling this last month, and I was told, you have to understand we're trying, but we don't have a shrinking space. We have a shrinking space, civil society. Let me tell you about shrinking space. People in the Global North, raise your hands. How many of you have been kidnapped with 2 guns pointed in your head? How many of you have been robbed with machine guns, 5 machine guns, just right outside your office? But don't talk to me about shrinking space. We have no pity for you. None. None. So what are you doing? And it's just really, scientists are, you heard that they were chaining themselves outside in the streets when the IPCC report came. I'm actually not thinking that taking the streets and chaining yourselves in the
What's up?
Hey, what's up?
Feel free to mute yourselves in Discord.
Oh shit!
Uh-oh.
All right, so is the ad running now?
No, I think it already ran.
The ad already ran, so we now have 28 minutes of no pre-roll.
All right, sick. All right, welcome to Subversive History, a Twitch stream about anti-capitalism, anti-colonialism, and like we've been covering, we're gonna continue to cover Jason Hickel's The Divide, not Jackson Hinkle, Jason Hickel. He's South African, not American. And
He was born in Swaziland, right?
Swaziland, yeah. And the chapter today is chapter 5, Debt and the Economics of Planned Misery. And it's going to be pretty data heavy, so it's going to be a little bit different than the last episode that we were able to find a lot of like peripheral stuff. And there's also going to be a lot of mentions of economic hitmen. So I hope you're prepared for that. What's up, Dorian? What's up, Sam?
What's up, Dorian? What's up, Sam? Thank you guys so much for being here. Your participation is constantly appreciated. But yeah, looking forward to keep getting through this book. Haven't been about 2 years since I last read it through. This reread has just reaffirmed how essential I think this book is for understanding not only like the history of the world, but the current economic standing that we exist in. I guess it would be smart to kind of go through like a play-by-play of kind of like how we got to the chapter that we're about to get on today. So essentially what we've already covered in the first, we're pretty much a little over halfway through this at this point. How we arrived here so far is in the first few chapters, we kind of discussed things such as like, what is poverty? How is poverty calculated? In what ways is this a fictitious representation of poverty in the world? How are systems of poverty created and how are they maintained artificially? Then we go into a really deep historical analysis of the events which created the divide that exists within the world. Things such as colonialism, things such as slavery, things such as the intangibles that are created in a society other than just the monetary gains of slavery and colonialism. Then we get into like kind of the quote unquote post-colonial period following World War II, and the things leading up to that, such as the Roaring Twenties, the Great Depression, the advent of Keynesianism / New Deal politics, followed by what was called the Age of the Coup, in which many third world countries coming out of this era of formal colonialism, I use finger quotes there and use the word formal because, as many of us know, these mechanisms of neo-colonialism continue to persist to this day, but the old school style of formal colonialism did have a downturn following World War II. And in that, many of the global South nations sought to emulate certain things that Europe and the United States were doing in terms of their economic policies, such as state-led development projects. So then brings us to the hypocritical response of the United States and Western European nations, essentially saying, development for me, but not for thee, and not allowing third world nations to engage or embark in similar economic development programs that had benefited the West so greatly. The coups that came as a result of that sabotage from the West. And I think that's about where the last chapter ends. This advent of neoliberalism that followed Keynesianism. So we kind of like went up, I would say, into about the 70s, and then got into like just brushing up against the 80s. So today we're going to talk more about how these systems of neocolonialism continue to perpetuate poverty and increase poverty throughout the third world for the economic benefit of Europe and the United States.
Right. And I think it's pretty interesting how so far he's presented some pretty sound evidence that the conditions that led to them needing to practice this new form of colonialism only happened because because they were trying to I guess like, you know, play it their way and try and take advantage of these like developing nations' economies, right? If I'm not mistaken.
Can you repeat the question?
Like the only reason
that.
that they were even so like fervently anti-protectionist is because these other countries were trying to develop finally after colonialism. So if colonialism had never happened, right, or at least if the US had been like, you know, what's the word, like willing to kind of like help these countries develop during these protectionist periods instead of like being hostile to those protectionist methods of development, right? It literally all of this could have been avoided.
Theoretically, yeah, of course, this could have been avoided, and all of these nations that control, or I guess naturally possess an abundance of natural resources that are in high demand around the world, could have harnessed that resource rich, the richness of their own resources, and then they could in turn capitalize on those and divert the profits of that into their own development, things like their own industry, things like education, things like public works, that the things that we know are essential to a thriving economy and a thriving society. But the term that I'm going to keep using is kneecapped. They've been essentially kneecapped, you know, since the time of colonialism up into the present day, kneecapped from the things that are essential to this economic and societal development.
Like the Irish rap group.
So just to kind of get into where we're kind of going to start off here in this chapter. This chapter is called, and it's the title of our stream today, Debt and the Economics of Planned Misery, referring to what I was just saying, the very intentional kneecapping of third world economic development. This chapter starts with a subsection called Debt and the, never mind, that's not a subsection, Debt and the Economics of Planned Misery. And it starts out by discussing a contrast or an antagonistic relationship between two international bodies. One that is called the New International Economic Order. I'll bring this up just so that we can all read together, get a better idea of what we're talking about. Okay, so the New International Economic Order was something that was created kind of in the vein of the non-aligned movement or the Bantung Conference of third world nations wanting to have some degree of mutual cooperation to develop their nations, to have more of a harmonious connection with one another, and to help reinforce and galvanize one another in terms of global trade, to not be, you know, a standalone nation in a world of predatory multinational corporations. So the NIEO is a set of proposals advocated by developing countries to end economic colonialism and dependency through a new interdependent economy. The main NIEO document recognized that the current international economic order was established at a time when most of the developing countries did not even exist as independent states, and which perpetuates inequality. In the spirit of trade, not aid, the NIEO called for changes in trade, industrialization, agricultural production, finance, and transfer of technology. The UN General Assembly adopted the Declaration for the Establishment of New International Economic Order and its accompanying program of action on May 1974. So this is a recognition from third world countries that they have not got a fair shake at this deal whatsoever. They are victims of an unequal exchange that exists within global trade dominated by the West. They are not getting paid adequately for their resources, nor are they getting paid adequately for their labor. They are being held to account for deals that were made under unscrupulous circumstances, under colonialism or gunboat diplomacy, or otherwise extremely coercive international pressures. And this is essentially saying that we don't want to stand for things that were made under these coercive terms. So, and then the opposing side of this would be the G7. We'll get the G7 up here also. G7. Okay.
Yes, we're going to use the most trusted name in news.
Well, what, for Wikipedia?
Oh,
Is
yeah,
that
no,
you?
like the video that I found for it.
Oh, right. So now we have the G7, which is the opposing organization, as an intergovernmental political forum consisting of Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the United Kingdom and the United States. Additionally, the European Union, EU, is a non-enumerated member. It is officially organized around shared values of pluralism and representative government, with members making up the world's largest IMF advanced economies and liberal democracies. As of 2020, G7 members account for over half of global net wealth at around 200 trillion, 32 to 46% of global GDP, but only 10% of the world's population. So there's some telling numbers there. Obviously, this is a major conglomerate of the most wealthy civilizations in the world. Not all of them Western. Obviously, Japan is included in there as well.
You're telling me that Japan isn't part of the West?
I guess maybe
it's funny because like they always kind of like just shoehorn Japan into that, like, you know, whenever like we talk about the West.
If you ask Theodore Roosevelt, then sure, he would be.
Well, I mean, like if you talk to like Benjamin Franklin about like, you know,
Theodore Roosevelt was like the original weeb. I don't know if you ever read about that, but he was pretty much like, Japan is the white people of Asia. Like that was like his
that's wild.
He was really hyped on Japan.
Also, it's really, really funny and kind of telling that, like, you know, all of these countries like less than 30 years ago were just in like a gigantic war, and now they're suddenly getting along so very good. What, less than like 30 years after the fact?
Well, Japan and the United States, it became extremely friendly, pretty much, I would say, within months of the atomic bombs dropping. And both of them went arm in arm against the Korean people pretty much immediately after World War II in a disgusting act of anti-democracy and anti-freedom and anti-self-determination. So yeah, and you know, we don't even need to get into the renazification of Western Germany. You know, electing many prominent Nazi figures into their political structure, just not even years after, you know, Nazism and Imperial Japan were public enemies number one. It really shows like the absolute spinelessness of American foreign policy in terms of.
I don't think it's
willing to ally with. But war criminals of Japan who were sanctioned as war criminals were like just later playing golf with Prescott Bush.
Right. Well, because I think it's like it's an important thing not to forget. They never called themselves the Axis powers. Right. When you learn that in the history class, you know that like, oh, like the bad guys are the Axis, right? And the good guys are the Allied. They never called themselves Axis. They called themselves the Anti-Comintern Pact. And what's like the most important thing after World War II, right? The most important thing to get on the good side of U.S. foreign policy, especially
being an anti-communist,
being
on the right side. Yeah. So, little cliff note there, which is always a fun conversation. But you know, so we see here these two.
You're welcome,
I guess it's not apparently diametrically opposed, but in practice diametrically opposed groups the NIEO, Alliance of Developing Countries, and then the G7, which is actually not a any kind of like a formal. It's completely non-governmental in this sense.
It's like a pinky promise.
Yeah, look here.
It's like a friendship bracelet.
The G7 is not based on a treaty, and there's no permanent secretariat or office. It's ordered through a presidency that rotates annually. While lacking a legal institutional basis, the G7 is widely considered to wield significant international influence. It has catalyzed several major global initiatives, blah, 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 blah. It's been criticized by observers for its allegedly outdated, limited membership, narrow global representation, and ineffectualness. It also opposed by anti-globalization groups with all
the globalists.
Summits. So now we have obviously the NIEO, which I just read over, which is the Alliance of Third World Nations wanting to, team up harmoniously for a mutual aid and development and to not be preyed upon so easily by multinational corporations. Then we have the G7, which is essentially the leaders of world imperialism, historically and contemporarily. And also we can see that they also have, it's spelled out right here, the gross disproportionate control that they kind of have here. Whereas, they only represent 10% of the world population, yet account for, over half of global net wealth and a very large percentage of global GDP.
And with their powers combined, they form Captain Austerity.
Very much austerity discussion coming up. Okay,
I love this quote that he mentions, like Henry Kissinger, and about the formation of the G7. Henry Kissinger, the U.S. Secretary.
Kissinger was part of the G7, right?
Yeah, Henry Kissinger, the U.S. Secretary of State at the time, laid out the new geopolitical strategies that the group would use. He proposed to shift the most important decisions at the UN away from the General Assembly to the Security Council, which the rich nations controlled. Next, he laid out plans to divide the G77 by using aid as an instrument of control. And the G77, I don't know if you remember from like previous chapters, was talked about is like the 77 countries that were like the non-aligned movement, but like the sequel. It's like, it's like the reboot of the non-aligned movement.
So, and now I think Jason Hickel has a really amazing quote here that's kind of going to set this chapter off. And it really poetically describes this transition from the formal process of colonization to this new era of neoliberal neo-colonization. And he states, instead of conquistadors on horses or secret agents in smoke-filled rooms, or maybe on carousels, this time the job is done by bankers and bureaucrats, an army of men in gray suits with briefcases, dealing in nothing more than glamorous loan portfolios. If that sounds familiar to anyone of this topic, you may have heard this type of language discussed in this book, which is The Confessions of an Economic Hitman. This is a copy of the new Confessions of an Economic Hitman, which is like an amended version. It has more in it. It's like he released it a second. If I understand it correctly, it has more. So it has more content in it. I think it's the same. It's not like a sequel. It's like the same book with some additional information. So this book by John Perkins is a personal testimony / a little bit of a biography about his time working as one of these non-governmental professionals that would go to countries and essentially promote extremely over-exaggerated loan programs. Like essentially he would go to Indonesia and be like, you need an electric grid like this, you need all like things that were like far and away what was necessary to be able to produce a loan that is so egregiously large that it essentially captivates the country for decades or centuries or in perpetuity. How do you like
yes.
that? So more on John Perkins later, and we're definitely going to start going into the metrics by which this is achieved, not just in John Perkins' personal testimony, which he wrote a book about, probably one of the more famous books that we'll even mention on this stream. What I mentioned prior, the 3 books that I always mention for individuals starting to learn about economics and economics history from a leftist perspective. It is The Divide by Jason Hickel. It is 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism by Haju Chang, and Talking to My Daughter About the Economy by Yanis Varoufakis. I would also include Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins as well. More on him later. Johnny, do you have anything you want to cap off that little section of the book with?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that, like, I forget who the hell I heard it from.
Oh, before we start, shout out to Amazing Wolf Skeptic. Good to see you in chat.
Also.
Very happy you're here. Go ahead.
I think it was either Mark Ames or Gary Britcher. I forget which one, that was talking about like the after the forced dissolution of like the Soviet Union, right? There was like the White House that they have, right? And apparently, like, within a day of, like, you know, them transitioning away from like the Soviet Union and into the new government, right, there was just a swarm of these like US businessmen, exactly as that was described, was like these briefcases just like offering deals to like anybody they could, right, especially if they were in charge of any kind of like state asset or natural resource.
I'm sorry. I tried to type. First of all, I spelled it wrong, and then I tried to hit like control to like put it under.
You got close enough. Like, that's
I get books in here, and I'm listening, and I'm trying to type. I'm sorry. So it's 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism by Haju Chang. Talking to My Daughter About the Economy by Yanis V. Those two books, as well as the one that we've been talking about for the last few weeks. So that one's in the Jason Hickel, The Divide.
Also, you know, if you're like me and, you know, reading is kind of hard sometimes, and like, you know, you just want to watch some shit. Giannis has more than a few videos on YouTube of him speaking, you know, doing live speaking engagements that, like, you know, are great, very educational. And I highly recommend.
He has this one that is just incredible. I'm going to put it in the chat right now. Especially in terms of like, it's called The Failure of Capitalism. This one right here.
I thought you were going to use the one where he's talking to that woman at like the church or something.
Yeah. I know the one you're talking about. Yeah, this one's great. If anybody wants to watch a great lecture, that's all the books. I said there's 3. The 2 I just put in there. Well, and then there's this one, the Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins. That would be the 4th. So the main subject, 23 Things, Talking to My Daughter, and then New Confessions. Those would be the 4 and then we can start getting into David Harvey and Samir Amin and probably some other stuff if I went and looked at my bookshelf. Thank you, Lily. Or was that you?
It was me.
Okay. Moving forward. So now we're kind of getting to this point in this process of third world nations becoming more conscious of the resource abundance that they have within their borders, and how that they can use that. They can leverage their own resources for the benefit of their own country. I know that sounds crazy for a nation to be able to, you know, have some kind of dominion over the resources that their nation controls so that their own people may benefit from it. I know that sounds absurd. I know that sounds revolutionary. I know that sounds extremist, but we're going to fiddle around with that idea a little bit. So a big way that comes into play in the 60s and the 70s is by OPEC. And we'll pull up OPEC here just so we can all learn together. Here we go. Okay. All right. OPEC is the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries. It is a cartel of 13 countries founded in September 1960 in Baghdad by Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. It has since 1965 been headquartered in Vienna, Austria. If you think that's weird, it's because they decided that no one country should have, for like a non-biased location, it just shouldn't be in any of the participant countries. So I guess they decided Austria would be a good neutral ground to have this. So that's the reason for that. When I first read that, I was like, why would it be in Austria? But that is the reason. Although Austria is not an OPEC member state. As of September 2018, the 13 member countries accounted for an estimated 44% of global oil production and 81.5% of the world's proven oil reserves, giving OPEC a major influence on global oil prices that were previously determined by the so-called Seven Sisters, grouping of multinational oil companies. Seven Sisters is the collection of major oil conglomerates, also known as Big Oil. ExxonMobil, Shell, Total Energy.
Wait, why is BP in there? BP's English. What the fuck?
What the fuck? Chevron, Phillips 66, Valero, and E9 Coconut Phillips. So this is the Seven Sisters for reference. Go to the organization. So just to kind of give you a little background, and this is where we're kind of coming into this discussion of this chapter. In a series of steps in the 1960s and the 1970s, OPEC restructured the global system of oil production in favor of oil-producing states and away from an oligopoly of dominant Anglo-American oil firms, aka the Seven Sisters. Coordination among oil-producing states within OPEC made it easier for them to nationalize oil production and structure oil prices in their favor without incurring punishment from Western governments and firms. Prior to the creation of OPEC, individual oil-producing states were punished for taking steps to alter the governing arrangements of oil production within their borders. For example, states were coerced militarily. The US-UK sponsored a coup against Mohammad Mossadegh after he nationalized Iran's oil production. We went into that in more detail during our last stream. Or economically, the Seven Sisters slowed down oil production in one non-compliant state and ramped up oil production elsewhere, that when acted contrary to the interests of the Seven Sisters and their governments. So this OPEC pact of oil producing nations came together to some degree of solidarity so that these oil producing countries could insulate themselves from the coercion and manipulation of, I guess, what you could refer to as a monopsony of oil purchasers. And obviously that unequal power dynamic was abused in a number of ways, but most famously in the overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran. So
for those in chat that are wondering, wait, did he just mispronounce monopoly? No, monopsony is a market situation in which there is only one buyer. Today I learned.
Or at least, like, the same way that monopoly doesn't usually mean exclusively one. A monopsony, in the terms of the Seven Sisters, meaning that there's seven that completely got dominated, that would still be considered a monopsony, even though it's not necessarily mono.
Right.
For the sake of economic discussion, like Standard Oil was not a monopoly in the literal sense. But when you dominate such an extreme share, something like Google or something like that, these are still considered monopolies, and a monopsony is the other side of that. So, okay. So, OPEC, as a result of the 7-day war in Israel,
I thought it was 6
during
days.
the 7-day war, what's up?
I thought it was 6 days.
I thought it was a 7-day war. Is it a 6-day war?
6 day. 6 day.
This is a 6-day war. Okay, I'm sorry. I must have mistyped.
6, 7, what's the difference?
So,
it's not like there would be any lasting impact to those 6 days, right?
Yeah. So during this time, let's just say right here, at the time of the cessation of hostilities, Israel had seized Syria's Golan Heights, the Jordanian annexed West Bank, including East Jerusalem, Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, and as well as Egyptian-occupied Gaza Strip. So during this war, Israel annexed land from several of its neighbors, which aggravated much of the Middle East. It's funny how they generally try to frame Israel as this babe in the woods of the Middle East, where it's like, oh, why is everyone so mad at us? Why do people, are we, is there hostility? And it's like, very few times is it like, well, maybe it doesn't have to do with, freedom or democracy or Western values or anything like that. Maybe it has more to do with the fact that even early in your statehood, you annexed land from most of your neighbors. But that's a topic for another stream.
Another stream altogether.
Yeah. So, in response to this, OPEC nations raised prices dramatically in protest of Western support of Israel. So, I believe there was an embargo.
Mm-hmm. The United States stepped in to support Israel, its main ally in the region, with an immense shipment of military aid. Arab states were upset by this move as it gave Israel an unexpected advantage. So they retaliated by unleashing the oil weapon, working with Saudi Arabia and OPEC. They raised the price of oil by 70%, hoping this would force the U.S. to back down. The U.S. was undeterred. In fact, 3 days later, President Nixon asked Congress to deliver an additional $2.2 billion with a B in military aid to Israel. In response, the Arab coalition took an even more extreme step, imposing a total embargo on oil shipments to the U.S. and a partial embargo on shipments to Western Europe. By the end of the embargo in March 1974, the price of oil had risen by $3 per barrel to nearly $12, which triggered the crisis of high inflation and low growth that characterized the 1970s. I don't know what the average age of everybody in here is, but if your parents, were at all alive during the 70s, I'm sure they remember, or can tell you about how shitty the economy was in the 70s and how often, especially the economic crashes that we have faced in the last 15 years, right, are compared to that time in the 70s.
Right. Thank you so much for coming in with that quote, because I was fumbling there for a second.
You're good, man. That's why there's two of us.
That was absolutely perfect. So this oil crisis had a resounding effect on the world, not just the United States. Much like, when I started reading about history, I started reading about disasters that were happening in Japan and Korea and India as a result of the Great Depression. All my time reading about the Great Depression, I always thought it was this US centric issue. And I never realized the reverberations that this had to non-US nations that have a great dependence on the United States in terms of a market or someone to buy their resources and things like that, and how these financial issues have generally a much more dire effect on poorer nations than they do more affluent ones, such as the United States. You think the Hoovervilles and things like that were bad in the United States. Think about the issues that this imposed on Guatemala, who is so dependent on the United States buying their coffee and things like that. And then when coffee drops off the face of the earth, because it's kind of a luxury that is not being purchased so much because of the Great Depression, you have immense poverty going on in Guatemala. That's just a quick example. But so OPEC, this situation that we just described here, this dynamic of the OPEC nations raising the price and even going as far to fully embargo the United States from purchasing their oil. This financial crisis had disastrous effects on the third world also. So these types of loans and developmental projects that are spurned by the IMF and the World Bank start coming into play here as ways to band-aid over these financial crises. There's a quote from the book here that I think is extremely relevant to this. Loan pushers were trained to invent inflated projections of how beneficial the loans would be, manipulating statistics to convince governments to borrow even if they knew full well that they would never be able to repay. Pushers often focused specifically on dictatorships, since given the absence of democratic accountability, they were much more likely to accept these risky loans, which they could very easily use to line their own pockets, either by stealing the money directly from public accounts or by channeling it through the government and into their own contracting businesses. In this sense, the dictatorships that the US government helped install during the 1950s and the 1960s, as in Guatemala, Chile, and the Congo, suddenly proved useful in a new way. So Couple of things that I have here just to illustrate that, which I thought was interesting. So, what was the first one that they stated there? It was Chile. And if you were here for our last stream, you would have noticed that
would have been under the direction of Pinochet and what, Friedman?
Yes. Well, we went through Pinochet at length, who he was, how he came to power, the grotesque excesses that occurred under his rule, and the economic implications of that coup. So now, when we read this breakdown of how these new loan pushers utilized dictators that were formally imposed by the United States to take out excessive and almost non-repayable loans. And then obviously there is so many countries that are under this kind of debt predatory lending scenario. But as you mentioned, Chile, Guatemala, and the Congo, we have a little bit of evidence of that I wanted to bring up. So just for example, by the early 1980s, Chile's economic experiment took a turn for the worst. When they say economic experiment, they mean neoliberal free market policies that pretty much ruined the nation in a few short years. Inflation began to increase again, and the amount of the population in poverty increased drastically, reaching over 40% of the population. The shock economics of the Chicago boys lost favor with the dictatorship, and one by one, they were forced out and replaced by more moderate economists. These economists were not given the same amount of freedom to experiment, and so the influence of the IMF over the economy greatly increased. Even more free market reforms were passed, and the size of the IMF loans was drastically increased. In 1985 alone, over $800 billion was loaned out to Chile. So, just to kind of make a greater sense of that, we have a nation who elected had a democratically elected leader who was employing state-led developmental processes for the benefit of the Chilean people. This was forcibly removed by the United States, violently imposed a dictator of their choosing, who then also imposed the economic structuring that they desired. It was a disaster, but then another Western institution, the IMF, comes in and starts loaning hundreds of millions of dollars to this dictator. So we have this dynamic where an individual that the Chilean people never voted for or did not choose is now running roughshod over the Chilean economy and putting it into hundreds of millions of dollars in debt. Okay, so that's for Chile. The next one is Guatemala. Let's see what we have here. One moment. Okay. For those of you that are aware of the situation in Guatemala, Jacobo Arbenz, who was the democratically elected president of Guatemala, who was undergoing a process of land reform to have a more equitable distribution of land to Guatemala's landless peasants, taking the land from the Colossus banana company, the United Fruit Company, who was essentially running Guatemala as a private fiefdom, extracting massive wealth from the company for U.S. corporations. Jacobo Arbenz was again violently disposed, and there was a dictator who was supplanted with, handpicked by the United States, whose name was Castillo Armas. Just as a quick okay, so you can just see here just some. You can see here just a couple figures here. These were grant aid that was taken out by Castillo Armas, the dictator chosen by the United States, in the millions of dollars for proposed developmental projects. So again, we have another example of a dictator handpicked by the United States, taking out millions and millions of dollars in loans from the West, and indebting the country through an individual that was never elected by the Guatemalan people.
Sounds democratic.
Well, the United States is the beacon of democracy in the world.
Yeah, we're just giving democracy all across the globe.
This situation persisted even longer. If you know further into Guatemalan history, you will be aware of a nefarious bastard named Rios Montt, who was an individual who Ronald Reagan was extremely fond of, but he was also a brutal genocidal murderer. He's actually been found guilty of genocide by a Guatemalan court since the end of the Civil War. But just to kind of
Ronald Reagan, friends with a brutal genocidal dictator.
Yes. So let's see here. Where is it?
Sure, you got the right Ronald Reagan.
This is actually a Latin American Weekly article from July 1983. Let's see.
The president of jelly beans, friends with a
President
brutal.
Rios Montt comes under increasing pressure from all points of political spectrum. He has temporarily leased telephone through the use of rules. Since last summer, the president appears to have created enemies on sides, left-wing guerrillas. Never expected anything to last time, both urban and middle class. I'm sorry, I picked this. I know it says in here about him taking it. While these developments have alienated the liberal middle class, opinion writer, business protesters for this reason, for all the extremely conservative business community, the government's cautious economic policy, too left-wing and interventionist, right-wing businessmen continue to blame the government for foreign exchange shortages, a credit squeeze, and a complex system of import controls that have recently turned their fire against a new taxation scheme designed to meet conditions for an IMF loan. So here's Rios Montt changing conditions in Guatemala in 1983 so that he can meet the conditions for the IMF loan. Sorry, I kind of stumbled through that.
No, you're good.
So, and then finally, we have the Congo, which is, if you know anything about the Congo history at this time, this is a time where an individual named Patrice Lumumba attempted to lead like an anti-colonial struggle within the Congo. To create a more essentially like a very like Sankara-esque plan of rejecting debt peonage to the West, nationalization of the resources and the labor of the Congo for the use of the Congolese people. He was replaced by the U.S. backed tyrant Mobutu, who was an autocratic, kleptocratic, murderous psychopath, I would say, just like an absolute tyrannical madman, kind of like the poster boy of like that kind of like idea of like the African strongman. He was like a dictator among dictators, like the most I think he was also friends with Ronald Reagan, if I'm not mistaken. But
Reagan was friends with all those people. But we got a question in chat. Was Lumumba's struggle the one that Guevara went to the Congo to support? And I think so. No?
I didn't think so, but I don't know enough about that. I'm sorry, offhand. The timelines match up, though, don't they? They were both in the 60s. Although I wish I could give you a concrete answer on that. But just to continue on this situation with this violent kleptomaniac who enriched himself, well, kleptomaniac, I guess you could call him that, off the Congolese people. We can see here that during his time of doing this, while not only was he abusing and extractive massing wealth, during the dictatorship of Mobutu in Zaire, which is the Congo, he accumulated public external debt of roughly $14 billion. At the same time, Mobutu and his associates extracted wealth from the country. By 1990, real capital flight from Zaire amounted to $12 billion. That's capital flight. That's a whole different economic discussion. It plays into it, obviously. But Mobutu being a unelected and autocratic dictator who replaced the extremely popular and extremely, nationalistic Lumumba, who was deposed by like a joint French and Belgian, and I believe the United
Oh, and the
States
CIA. CIA admitted
and
to
the
it
CIA.
recently.
Yeah.
Yep.
Exactly. They deposed him and replaced him with this psychopath, who then indebted the Congolese people into an additional $14 billion. So that's just a pretty. That's only 3 nations, and I picked those 3 because he specifically mentioned them in the book. But I just wanted to illustrate this dynamic that, like, there might be this idea that, well, you took out a loan, you have to pay it. You know what I mean? You can't look at the World Bank and the IMF for, enforcing the payment of the loans that they put out. That's just how business works. And it's like, well, there's a little bit more involved than that, in that when you completely nullify the democratic will of the people of these nations and you impose who is obviously a either genocidal, torturous, kleptocratic individual in power, and then they're allowed to just take out billions of dollars in loans, and it doesn't matter to them because they're wealthy. They're the wealth. These are the conditions that fall upon the poorest of the country. They'll write any kind of loan agreement, and it doesn't matter to them. Now, in a decade or 2 decades, we have the people looking at these debts and being like, well, why would I be made to pay what was taken out of a brutal autocratic dictator that you imposed on my country?
Oh, not even just repay it with interest.
A lot of interest. So this leads us to what is called the third world debt crisis, because you have these third world nations which have these enormous debts that have been imposed on them in one coercive way or another, and part of this is receiving these loans requires what is called a structural adjustment, and that brings us to our next sub-chapter here, which is remote control power. Johnny, do you have anything that you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, again, Paul Volcker, Volcker, played a big part in jacking up the interest rate up as high as like 21%, right? And he's just the U.S. Federal Reserve chairman. So it's just like, again, like we're about to get into with the remote control power, you have people that are not elected by any of these people in the global south, right? Being basically left at the mercy, right, of these people that see them as not even just like numbers on a piece of paper, numbers on a screen. This is just like pure profit motive, right? To quote the book, in 1982, Mexico took the inevitable step and defaulted on part of its $80 billion debt. This move spurred other heavily indebted countries such as Brazil and Argentina to do the same, and set off became what was known as the third world debt crisis, which we are, about to get into. And it's also important to try and remember, at this point in the world, I believe that the dollar is considered the petrodollar. So pretty much the price of oil or petrol, is attached to that dollar. And you have to remember that that is the greatest kind of trade that you can get to or from the U.S. from any of these countries. This is the era of OPEC. This is the era of, everything needing and costing a lot of oil. And that's not just cars. That's not just transportation. That's not just oil tankers. We're also talking about the use of plastics. Think about the rise of single-use plastics in everyday life and how much oil, and yes, it uses oil, that costs to make all of these things. But let's just move on to the remote control power.
So, just to bring my brain back to where we're at right now, we have this situation where, again, third world nations have been released, at least nominally, from this colonial structure that they've been imprisoned in for, in some cases, centuries, if not decades, if not centuries at this point. And then when they decide to exercise some degree of autonomy with their own resources and their own labor pool and their own position in the world in terms of a global market, they are kneecapped, hampered, violently cooed, and otherwise coerced into falling back in line of the colonial ladder, essentially, so that they can still be exploited for resources, still be exploited for geopolitical advantage, and still be exploited for cheap labor. Now we're getting into a point where this becomes even more sinister, more insidious, should I say, where this is no longer being done, at least not always, with guns and bombs, which it still is frequently done, but it's done more insidiously and more subversively with predatory lending and loans from major international Western organizations such as the IMF and the World Bank. A major point here that cannot be understated in terms of this process is the concept of structural adjustments. You cannot understand the position that these nations are in without understanding structural adjustments. So this represents a more neoliberal turn in these organizations like the IMF and the World Bank. Whereas, free market ideology should dictate that if you give someone a loan, like let's say, let's break this down into really baby-brained anarcho ANCAP terms. If I lend Johnny $20 and he doesn't pay me back, whose fault is that?
It's yours, bro.
It's
you
mine.
The $20.
I made
we're never gonna get it back, bro.
I'm being punished by the free market because I learned that I should not give my money flippantly to an individual. This is the reason I'm bringing this up, is because like ANCAPs like to boil, immense economic transactions down to like, oh, capitalism is just, I decide that I want to go and buy this. And so, but the champions of free market ideology, such as, the United States and the IMF and the World Bank, who thinks that liberalization, market liberalization is the most fantastic thing that could be done within a nation. When they lend money, imagine you have two coconuts. Yeah, exactly. When they lend out their money, this is no longer a method of free market punishment where, well, we lended out money, it can't be paid back. We have been punished by the market. We took a dice roll on getting some interest on this capital by investing it into third world development programs. Even if we did it coercively and essentially at the point of a gun, we should just take our losses and go home.
Wouldn't you call that like, hands off, laissez-faire or whatever, like wouldn't that count as like...
Yeah, laissez-faire died in the Gilded Age. You can call that laissez-faire, but I mean, that would be like the closest thing to a realistic laissez-faire capitalist situation. Since then, we have neoliberalism, where instead of having a hands-off laissez-faire, we have the government backed and fronted by private organizations, private corporations and private interests, which drive the government to prop up markets. And that's exactly what happens with these IMF, with these loans, is that now the government is going to use government bailouts to assist like the Wall Street bankers that are responsible for these debt collections, as well as government assistance in collections of them. So this is where we get into structural adjustment. IMF nations would help. The IMF would help nations repay debt so long as these nations agreed to a series of structural adjustment programs, which are known as SAPs. That means that they would, an example, this would happen, they would redirect all existing cash flow to their debt. They would cut spending on public services like healthcare and education. They would cut subsidies on farming, food, and infant industries. And they would privatize public assets by selling state companies like telecoms and railways. So I know you're suffering from debt. I know that your people are poor. I know that sometimes you have a hard time getting water to certain segments of your society. So we'll give you money, but you have to agree to these policies of austerity, of privatization, and of liberalization. You have to cut down on public spending. So if you have food programs, if you have school programs, if you have healthcare programs, cut them. if you have state-run industries like public transportation, privatize it. And if you have any kind of markets that are being directed with like tariffs or taxes or anything like that, liberalize across the board. So, and this is so that you can, make your environment attractive for foreign investment.
Namely, Nestle.
Yes.
Do you have water? Do you have just water just laying around, just flowing everywhere? Let me introduce you to my friend James Nestle or whatever.
So now we've already kind of gone over how the West has sometimes directly, sometimes violently, sometimes indirectly, sometimes subtly fostered a climate of dependency in the third world and has created a gross power imbalance in terms of the economic structure of the world. Now they are dangling extremely necessary foreign investment and foreign aid, with the attached conditions of all of these austerity, privatization, and liberalization.
This sounds like coercion. You're telling me that the U.S. creates the position for them to need to be protectionist of their economy, and then when they start doing the protection of their economy for the betterment of their people, the U.S. either coups them, or embargoes them, or sanctions them, or we install a dictator that then takes out a loan, right? For that they don't want, that is extremely unpopular, that oftentimes isn't even used to fix the things that are wrong, right? And now, even if they overthrow the dictator, they still have to pay back the debt, right? That they didn't want in the first place.
Johnny, what's fair is fair.
This sounds like coercion.
Let's take a look here. We can kind of, just to illustrate this just a teensy bit,
Oh, damn, I already ripped this thing.
so that everybody can just get an idea of what we're talking about. And I know, like, see, the reason that you're going to see me using like Wikipedia so often on this is because like we're reading a book, and I just like, this isn't like a whole project that we're doing. We're reading a book, and we kind of want to illustrate it or corroborate it with a little bit of evidence. And obviously we could get into JSTOR and find some like dense article, but really just like in terms of like layman's a language to illustrate the points that are being made in the book that we revisit every couple of days.
Let me put it to you this way. If you and like you get 10 of your friends to subscribe, and we no longer have like, jobs outside of this, and this is like our full-time like gig, yeah, we'll go onto JSTOR and stuff. We'll match your willingness, all right? If you get 10 of your friends and 10 of their friends, subscribe to Subversive History, right? We'll start looking at JSTOR articles instead of Wikipedia. But like, ask yourself, if you were doing this practically for free, would you not also go on Wikipedia if you didn't know what the hell you were looking at?
Well, it isn't necessarily that we don't know what we're looking at, but like, I think it's good to just break it down in the simplest of terms, just in case someone's like, I have no idea what a structural adjustment is. And I can like, I'm a knucklehead that'll like bumble my way through trying to explain it, but here's just a really concise illustration of it.
Regardless, I'm going to go on Wikipedia, no matter how like far left I am or whatever. Like, yeah, I'm going to go on Wikipedia, see what Wikipedia says.
Right. Well, and also I think it helps that it's not like some like very niche, esoteric, maybe conspiratorial, like random, like left org thing that I'm getting my information from. This is just like, this is above the board status quo information. I'm not like, coming out of like the most highbrow academic texts or anything like that. SAPs consist of loans provided by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to countries that experience economic crisis that they have caused. Their purpose is to adjust the country's economic structure, improve international competitiveness, and restore its balance of payments. The IMF and the World Bank, two Bretton Woods institutions, require borrowing countries to implement certain policies in order to obtain new loans or to lower interest rates on existing ones. These policies are typically centered around increased privatization, liberalizing trade and foreign investment, and balancing government deficit. The conditionality clauses attached to loans have been criticized because of their effects on the social sector. And then just to go down here, conditions. Typical stabilization policies include balanced payments, budget deficit, monetary policy, eliminating food subsidies, raising the price of public services, cutting wages, and decrementing
domestic.
I've never pronounced that word before. I'm sorry. Domestic credit. Long-term liberalization of markets, privatization and divestiture of all or part of state-owned enterprises, creating a new financial institutions, improving governance, enhancing the rights of foreign investors, blah, 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 blah. So you get an idea of how a structural adjustment works, and you get the idea of how it's utilized by the World Bank and the IMF. So now that we've established that, now we can kind of go into the section called an adjusted world, which is referring back to the structural adjustment policies that are demanded essentially by the IMF and the World Bank for their ever so vital loans. Do you have anything, Johnny?
I mean, there was that one part of the book that was really good. I mean, he uses like the like model of lending that would never fly in a normal commercial banking. Like, should I read that? It's pretty good. I mean, I don't want to, do it to death, but like, imagine you walk into Barclays to get a loan for a new business. Now imagine that they will lend you only if you agree to give them complete control over your household, so that if your interest payments don't come in fast enough, they can garnish your wages, liquidate your house, and force your children to get jobs. Imagine further that you are not allowed to declare bankruptcy under any circumstances.
Yeah, that's the part that it's like
you can't default on this, all right?
Yeah.
Like, you're paying. If you can't repay your loan, you have to sell everything you own. Stop feeding your children. Stop buying whatever medicines you might need to stay healthy, and channel all that money into the bank. This literally sounds like the fucking how many different crises in the last like 15 years does it sound like in the US? The subprime mortgage lending, crisis, student debt crisis, everybody like not being able to afford or even like, being in debt up to their eyeballs in medical debt. Like, tell me this doesn't sound exactly like what's going on here domestically, and that this hasn't proven to be just like a stupendous failure.
Right. Well, and now this leads us to our next chapter, which I think is extremely relevant to the question that you just asked. And it's, we're going to outline with evidence why that this has been an abject failure. Because you may be asking yourself, or, you may ask yourself, or you may wonder, well, we're injecting millions or billions of dollars over decades into these poor countries for the sake of development, for the sake of, the ever, the miracle of liberalized economy and free markets should be uplifting these nations to the echelon of Western European imperial core countries. So
it's like getting like smudging from like the hippie shop, it should just get all them demons out, get all that bad energy out of the wiring in your house,
So let's talk about the consequences and the effects of this lending and the structural adjustment programs that come along with these loans and the perpetual debt cycle that these nations find themselves in. So in a lot of third world nations, you had a once prospering climate of developmentalist process. This is the nations that we spoke about before, where certain countries such as Chile attempted it, Brazil attempted it, Argentina attempted it. They attempted it. Yeah, we could go through
at gunpoint.
Many, we talked about the Congo, we talked about Guatemala. We could go through almost every third world nation that had a attempted socialist or nationalist economic policy, and how that was thwarted artificially by the West. We've said this so much that it's becoming exhausting, but it's so essential to understand the 20th century development of the world. But in a once time where a lot of these countries were thriving and were showing growth, during a period of robust state-led development in the 60s and the 70s, global South nations enjoyed a 3.2% income growth rate. During the structural adjustment era, the 80s and the 90s, income growth rates plunged to 0.07%. So you have several times in the negative in terms of income growth rate during these periods. So these major financial institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, step in when these nations were conducting their own processes of development to success with successful results, being like, you're not doing this right. This is how you have to do it. Privatization, austerity, liberalization. And we see a dramatic decline in income, in GDP, and otherwise in every other social metric that you would use to indicate a flourishing economy. So there is a quote from the book that I think entails this. Liberalization did not help global South countries grow their way out of debt. Instead, the money for debt repayment had to be gained from more direct forms of appropriation, austerity, and privatization. So we have some charts here, which are always fun.
Charts. And these charts, like, you know, I know like the last couple episodes have been like pretty down, pretty depressing, but these charts, they're also depressing. They are also just robbed, broken dreams.
So here we have, this is the GDP per capita in Latin America from 1960 to the year 2000. So here we can see kind of the era of more of a government-led process of protectionist development, and line go up. We have line go up, which is always line go up. But then here we have a major kind of.
Who was elected president in 1980?
What? It was Reagan, right? Are you looking it up?
Yeah, sure? Yeah. It was Ronald Reagan. Yeah.
It was Ronald Reagan.
It was Ronald. Literally, like, as soon as Ronald Reagan takes office, the line go down.
And if you see this, the gray line in the graph indicates hypothetical income had the 1960-1980 trend continued. Line continues to go up.
Right.
So now we can see the same dynamic in sub-Saharan Africa, and it's an even greater departure from the progress that they had once enjoyed.
I mean, look, the only difference between these two graphs is that, like, you can't blame the second graph entirely on Ronald Reagan. There was definitely, like, France and the UK and, like, you know, the Dutch or whoever the fuck else was definitely getting involved in keeping that line, like, from going up. But it's just, it's fucking depressing because it's like, you know, Africa, especially like sub-Saharan Africa, I think, right, has like some of the richest and resources like in the globe.
Yes, especially now, and it's crazy because Africa's natural wealth has persisted almost through like every revolution.
Of the Industrial Revolution.
Exactly. It's like, you know, rubber didn't matter up until the revolution. Like, you know, first there was ivory, which was like very important, and then there's like tin and copper and gold,
bauxite,
and, like, tons of shit that like is necessary. And then the Industrial Revolution happens, and for a while, fucking rubber was like pointless. Like, what did you need rubber for? Now you have the Revolution. The Congo is full of rubber trees. You have Leopold's, Congo Free State Colony, which is one of the greatest atrocities in history, where they're like, oh, great, we needed rubber. You had rubber. Now we're going to steal all your rubber. Now, even in this like new electric car like thing where like, you know, cobalt and lithium are going to be like, the Congo and Africa are still like, okay, perfect. It's still all in Africa. And luckily we own Africa.
Luckily, we still own Africa.
Yeah.
And AFRICOM, right? Do you know when AFRICOM actually like became a thing?
No.
In 2007. Do you want to know what's not under jurisdiction of AFRICOM?
What?
Egypt. But yeah, it's just wild that, like, you know, this like central command of Africa right? That I think is based in Ethiopia. I don't know. I could be wrong. Whatever. The point is that like it's headquartered in Kelly Barracks, Stuttgart, Germany, which is. But like the fact that United States Africa Command, like why does that even exist? Imagine like there being like fucking Canadian Central Command of like Central America.
Right. So, and now we kind of go into the Robert Pullen, who's an economist, estimates that global South countries hemorrhaged roughly $480 billion per year in potential GDP during the 80s and the 90s. And during those same years, where per year they were losing roughly 480 billion per year, they were receiving aid disbursements at 100 billion per year.
Right.
So we have this climate where, these nations need aid. The IMF and the World Bank need to provide them aid. But in terms of like real wealth, about 5 times as much GDP or income or wealth, or however you want to quantify that, is being extracted from the from the country, which is 5 times more than the 100 billion that they're receiving in aid per year. So at face value, just in the ones and twos, it's not even some like abstract concept or like secondary or tertiary issue that is causing like this hemorrhaging. It's like you can just look at it and be like, oh no, wait, this is obvious.
Right.
We are extracting hundreds of more billions of dollars than they are receiving in this aid that we state that they so desperately need. Whereas if they were just able to take control of their own economies and their own resources, they would have an abundance of wealth to divert to their own domestic needs, as well as grow their own economies internationally.
Right. And you might say to yourself, like, holy crap, the economy is screaming. Like, why are these people just taking this? Like, why aren't they all kind of like, rising up and resisting this? Like, well, they did, like, a lot. By 1992, some 146 IMF riots had played out in 39 countries subject to these structural adjustments. Right.
I have some specific information that I wanted to go over that. Right before I get into that, though, we can get an even clearer picture by looking at the divide between different regions of the world. In the year 2000, Americans enjoyed an average income roughly 9 times higher than their counterparts in Latin America, 21 times higher than people in the Middle East and North Africa, 52 times higher than sub-Saharan Africans, and no less than 73 times higher than South Asians. And here too, the numbers have been getting worse. The gap between the real per capita incomes of the global North and global South has roughly tripled in size since 1960. So we have this campaign, this paternalistic humanitarian campaign by the West, that we want to end poverty in the third world. And we have our financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank that are going to make sure that they get the funds that they so desperately need. And meanwhile, per capita incomes of the global North and global South has roughly tripled in size since the 1960s. The gap between them, I'm sorry, not the individual income, but the gap between those two incomes. So we are seeing a further consolidation of the world's wealth in the global North as year by year. And this is not alleviating global poverty whatsoever. It is actually increasing global poverty. But you bring up, and I just wanted to read this real quick. Indeed, structural adjustment turned out to be the greatest single cause of impoverishment in the 20th century. The number of people living on less than $5 per day increased by more than 1 billion during the 1980s and the 1990s. So we can see here through the evidence, just through the statistics, that this process of the IMF and World Bank issuing loans to these countries, fostering their independence, and then further kneecapping their economic and social development with structural adjustment policies, we can see that this is a failure, or at least it's a failure if it was sincerely intended to alleviate poverty, which I don't believe it was, and Jason Hickel doesn't believe that it was. But much like you said, we have the emergence of. Oh, here's one more. One more thing. Oops. Okay. Okay. I actually read the wrong part. I'm sorry. When I did that before, we can get a better sense for how devastating structural adjustment was by zooming in on particular regions, countries, and cities. Take Africa, for instance, which suffered a total of 31 structural adjustment programs during the 80s and the 90s. In Dar es Salaam, public expenditure per person was cut by 10% per year during the 1980s. In Khartoum, 1.1 million people were added to the ranks of the poor, many of whom had lost their public sector jobs during spending cuts. A structural adjustment program imposed on Harar, I'm sorry, I don't really know a lot of these areas, in 1981 raised the cost of living by 45% in a single year. Imagine cost of living, like, we talk about the inflation that we struggle with. We're struggling with inflation right now in the United States. Imagine if your cost of living went up by almost 50%.
What is current U.S. inflation rate, I wonder?
I'm not sure. But while you pull that up, 100,000 people ended up hospitalized due to malnutrition. This is the Ivory Coast. I'm not even going to do the French pronunciation. I apologize. In the Ivory Coast, the tiger of West Africa, poverty doubled in one single year between 87 and 88 as a result of structural adjustment programs. In Nigeria, the poverty rate rose from 28% in 1980 to an astonishing 66% by 1996. That's almost 3 times. Or no, that's about 2 times. I'm sorry. I don't want to be hyperbolic. In Algeria, the government was made to privatize 230 firms and fire 130,000 state workers. Poverty rates rose 15% in 1988 to 23% in 1995. So these institutions, such as the IMF and the World Bank, have a mission statement to decrease poverty. And we talked about it. They have these lofty goals. We're going to end world hunger. We're going to end poverty by the year 2020, whatever. And here we can see them having the exact opposite effect on these poor nations, which they claim to have such a earnest desire to alleviate their poverty.
And the annual inflation rate for the United States is 7.7% for the 12 months ended October 2022, after rising 8.2% previously, according to the U.S. Labor Department data published November 10th. The next inflation update is scheduled for release on December 13th. So what was their inflation rate again?
Well, it was a cost of living rise by 45%. And I think Sam makes a good point here. Inflation rate doesn't measure everything, just certain things, so it doesn't actually reflect how high the cost of living actually is. Right. So there may be more metrics going into that 45% rise than just inflation. So I don't want to erroneously conflate the two if there's more that went into that. And I just don't know.
It's kind of like how GDP doesn't actually mean that's what everybody is getting. You
Sure.
know what I mean? Yeah.
Well, GDP per capita, yeah. There's GDP and then there's GDP per capita. But yeah, and we could continue down, there's just more and more and more examples of this. And we could also look at this share of wages in national income. So we can see in 1970, in the high 30s or 40s, and then you can see this just decrease wages in terms of their percentage of national income, just decreasing. And that's taken from a paper called Age of Reverse Aid, meaning that aid is actually reversing, not reversing, but having a unintended consequence of actually being detrimental to poverty as opposed to alleviating it.
Right. So I think maybe now we want to talk about how strange it was that there were, however, some global South countries that did not implement across the board free market principles. And not surprisingly, they managed to develop reasonably well, like Turkey, China, and the East Asian tigers, as they're listed in the book.
Yes.
And I sent the link in the Discord if you want to pull up that website I found describing who the fuck are the East Asian tigers? I've never heard that term before in my life.
I've heard it a few times.
In this book?
No. I mean, they call it the miracles and things like that. It's referred to.
Ah.
Okay. All right, four Asian tigers, what they are, economic strength is explained. The four Asian tigers are the high-growth economies of Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan. Fueled by exports and rapid industrialization, the four Asian tigers have consistently maintained high levels of economic growth since the 1960s and have collectively joined the ranks of the world's wealthiest nations. Should I just keep reading, or is there anything you specifically have?
Yeah.
Hong Kong and Singapore are among the most prominent worldwide financial centers, while South Korea and Taiwan are essentially hubs for the global manufacturing of automobile and electronic components, as well as information technology.
I wonder for who.
Key takeaways. The four Asian tigers are high-growth economies of Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan. All four economies are fueled by exports and rapid industrialization, have achieved high levels of economic growth since the 1960s.
The 1960s, you say?
Yes. The countries that make up the four Asian tigers share common characteristics, including sharp focus on exports, educated populace, and high savings rates. Keep going.
I think you don't have to read them, but just scroll down to like the rest of them. I just think it's fairly interesting that like all of these countries, right, are predominantly making goods, right, that aren't like labor intensive. Well, not labor intensive, but I forget how David Harvey puts it, but like that they were kind of like given the keys towards economic development by the US because what was going on in that same part of the world at that time, which country was developing in an economic model that was a little bit different than like, what the rest of the West was doing.
Right. And also, according to Jason Hickel, is that none of these programs had structural adjustment policies enforced on them for loans or anything like that. And you could even see that if they, they focused on education. I forget where they said it. I said
right there. Countries that make it for here common care, including sharp focus on exports, on educated populace, and high savings rates.
So like,
So
if you had like the structural adjustment programs inflicted on you, you would probably have to cut education. Also, I mean, I believe each of these countries, I know for sure Taiwan and South Korea were very much autocratic dictatorships for, you had the White Terror of Taiwan, which I believe was the longest period of martial law that's ever happened in modern history. Like since martial law has been a concept, I think Taiwan has had the longest running, I'm not saying they currently have it, but from like the time of Czech and the White Terror, I believe that's the longest period of martial law in history. South Korea under Syngman Rhee and Park Camp, I believe his name was, were periods of like immense dictatorship and civil unrest that was violently repressed by the government. And I don't believe that these nations necessarily took a very neoliberal methodology in their economies. I think there was a lot of robust state direction and tariffs and everything along those lines, which fostered the growth of these nations, and that other nations were not as fortunate to experience. And it's there's a common comparison between Norway and Venezuela, right? Where like, I believe that Norway has even more of its mineral and oil sectors nationalized than Venezuela. But for some reason, there has never been a violent coup or, embargo or sanctions against the nation of Norway. They have been allowed to exercise that self-determination over their own resources unimpeded, whereas Venezuela is essentially martyred, or should I say pariahed? Pariahed is the word that I was looking for. Pariahed amongst the international community.
Yeah, I just think it's fairly interesting that these specific countries, right, on this list, kind of all border or surround, or it's almost as if they were trying to boost these economies to outshine a certain other growing economy in the region.
Yeah, that would make sense too. And encirclement of China isn't some conspiracy. This is something that is like replete in Cold War documents and things like that. There was an active intention by the US to develop satellite states surrounding China, so that China can be monitored or patrolled, or however you want to refer to that as. So I think that's absolutely plausible. But with that being said, these policies that were inflicted by the IMF and their structural adjustment policies were so unpopular throughout the third world that, as Johnny had read earlier, that there was a period referred to as the IMF riots, where by 1992, 146 IMF riots occurred in 39 countries. Just a couple examples of those that we can go through real quick that I wanted to bring up just to illustrate that point. Stuff that you might not hear about. You'll probably hear about what happens in Venezuela when there's a food shortage as a result of some policy by Maduro or Chavez.
And even then, that policy, right, can't be dictated by them because 60% of the Venezuelan economy is still private. So it's actually just the private companies that own these sectors of the economy literally trying to make their own economy scream, right, to get whatever deal they want from the government that is trying to install like protectionist plans or some other kind of whatever the word is I'm looking for.
Right. So sorry. So
you light incense?
Yeah, I'm lighting incense. I have my office is the same room as the.
No, I know. Yeah.
Sometimes you got to burn a little incense in here. So the Caracazo is the name given to the wave of protests, riots, and looting that started in February of 1989, spreading to Caracas and the surrounding towns. The week-long clashes resulted in the deaths of hundreds of people, thousands by some accounts, mostly at the hands of security forces and the military. Venezuela was not Maduro or Chavez were not in power during these security forces and military murders. So this is not tyranny. This is not an abuse of state power or anything like that. At this point, this is fully above board. Countries can just do this without being.
It's a liberal democracy.
Liberal democracy. This isn't like any kind of out of the ordinary thing. No need to, examine that too deeply. The fall in oil prices in the mid-1980s caused an economic crisis to take hold in Venezuela, and the country had accrued significant levels of debt. This is literally just a 2-sentence summarization of the processes that we've been talking about for the past 2 hours. So, you can see this pattern repeating. Nevertheless, the administration of President Yami Lucinchi, it's an interesting last name, was able to restructure the country's debt repayments and offset an economic crisis, but allow for the continuation of the government's policies and social spending and state-sponsored subsidies. Great. Crisis was averted because we were able to continue government policies of social spending and state-sponsored subsidies. Hooray! Our economy can survive, and we
saved the day. We saved the city.
So. The following election, 1988, of Carlos Andrés Perez based his campaign and his legacy of abundance during his first presidential period and initially rejected liberalization policies. So he ran on anti-liberalization. The Venezuelan people were very favorable to anti-liberalization politicians at this time.
I wonder why.
He received 53% of the vote, while others gained at least 40%. At the time of his election, Venezuela's international reserves were only $300 million. Perez decided to respond to the debt, public spending, economic restrictions, and rentier state by liberalizing the economy.
Fuck.
He announced a technocratic cabinet and a group of economic policies recommended by the International Monetary Fund to fix macroeconomic imbalances known as the Great Turn, called by detractors as the economic package. Among the policies, there was the reduction of fuel subsidies and the increase of public transportation fares by 30%. Measures taken by Perez included privatizing state companies, tax reform, reducing customs duties, and diminishing the role of the state in the economy. He also took measures to decentralize and modernize the Venezuelan political system by the direct elections of state governors. The most controversial part of the economic package reform was the reduction of the gasoline subsidies, which had long maintained domestic gasoline prices far beneath international levels and even the production cost. The economic justice program was announced by the government on 16 February, and on the weekend, February 1989, gasoline prices rose 100%, and the fuel price increase in turn needed an increase in public transportation fares of 30% officially, and more in practice as some carriers refused to limit their prices to the official rate. The increase was supposed to be implemented in March of 1989, but bus drivers decided to apply the price rise in February, a day before payday in Venezuela. So
wait, go back up. There's that last little bit right there. That like, what's the hyperlink? Where does that take you to? I wonder.
These?
No. According to retired Venezuelan General Carlos Julio Panzola Zambrano, Cuban agents might have entered Venezuela during Carlos Andres Perez's inauguration ceremony, which was attended by Fidel Castro, and may have waited for unrest to occur in Venezuela so they could exacerbate political tensions. What's the hyperlink? Where does that take us? Fucking unfair.
Carlos Pena's El Delfín de Fidel, La Historia Oculta. It's a Spanish book.
How much you want to bet this is some like bullshit, fucking like, you know, Radio Free Havana bullshit?
I didn't even bring it up because I figured the claims were spurious at best, and I didn't even buy that. In 1989, there was Cuban agents in Venezuela at the inauguration ceremony, waiting suspiciously with their hands crossed, waiting for this riot that was, I guess, conspiratorially organized by Cuba somehow. This is like, wasn't there something? What is the thing about the conservative, or was it the Republicans that thought that there was like the voting machines were tampered with by Hugo Chavez or something?
Yes,
like that?
yes.
The ghost of Hugo Chavez was like, it was like, this is that level of. I was just gonna go right past it.
Where it's just like, no, I can't look right past it. Just because it happens.
There's no way that the population of Venezuela would riot because of in gasoline prices and a 30% increase in public transportation costs to further drive the knife in of the rising gasoline costs. That would never happen. It needs Cuban agents to instigate it. Fidel Castro. Yes. I love the fact that Fidel was there for the ceremony, and like it's like they decided he would be there too, because they were about to sow this riot. Yeah,
you know, the president of the country, this nefarious, you know, international villain of a country that's like, you know, what, the size of like a fucking, how big is Cuba? It's not, I know it's not that fucking big, right? It's causing all of this.
In terms of Caribbean countries, but it's tiny compared to most other countries.
The point is, it's sowing all this discord, you know, all along the North and South American continent, right? The author, General Pizzolo, works for a strategic consulting firm, i.e. the MIC. Wow.
Let's talk about this, though.
Thank you, Dorian.
Like, you know that something's bullshit when they, even for the thing, they can't even be, they can't even say it. Like, what you really do is just be like, maybe there might have been Cuban agents there.
It's like that ancient alien shit, or could it be that Cuban agents had entered the Venezuelan country?
We don't know for sure, but we don't know that they weren't there. That's the most important part, is that they could have. So
Cubanologists, you know, the hypothesize.
So that's one example of this this process of IMF structural adjustments causing immense economic related political unrest. Let's go to another one. Let's visit a different little continent here and see what else is going on.
Nothing good.
And if this one I thought was interesting because it's actually formally known as the anti-SAP riots. SAP meaning structural adjustment policy. So in 1989, anti-SAP riots were a series of violent student-led anti-government protests that occurred throughout Nigeria in 1989. The protests include students. Dude, tell me how weird this classification of people is, right? The protesters included students, non-students. That's literally 100% of people already. Employed workers, the unemployed, both of these things are like
children
and hoodlums.
And hoodlums.
Like, it just
What do
seems
they
like
mean by hood? Wait, there's a hyperlink for hoodlum.
area boys are looting street children who operate in the streets in Nigeria. Yeah. I read it through this article. I think the reason they put that is because there was like a crime, both hoodlums and non-hoodlums. Yeah, exactly. Like, it's this weird like way of being like, so both students and non-students represents 100% of the population.
Right.
Employed workers and unemployed is 100% of the population. And then they throw in school children and hoodlums into it. Like, okay, it seems like this is a pretty ubiquitous situation. It seems weird that you would even describe it in that way.
You could just say like Nigerian people in Nigeria.
People of Lagos were extremely dissatisfied with the structural adjustment policy.
Across the board. Like,
I thought that was so weird when I read that. But getting back into the specifics, the International Monetary Fund imposed structural adjustment program was introduced as a government policy in 86 in an attempt to stop the effects of falling oil prices and foster development of local industries. It was aimed at devaluing the naira. I'm not sure of that. I assume that's the Nigerian currency. Reduced welfare. And that's one of the craziest things. That's another thing that the structural adjustment says is like, you have to devalue your currency. Like, it's part of the structural adjustment programs to devalue currency.
yeah. Well, I mean, he talks about why they don't allow that to happen. I don't know if that's I believe it's in this part.
Well, here, check it out. Why it was aimed reduce welfare and mass reentrenchments and curbing corruption. These measures were to ensure that Nigeria qualified for IMF-issued loans. It represented a period of austerity measures, and as a result, Nigerians had to leave home earlier than usual for their daily commute due to the collapse in the transportation system. Well relegated to a single meal per day, and student accommodations were overcrowded. And then in 88, the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation announced an increase in the cost of petroleum products. The increased price of petroleum products led to a concomitant increase in food prices and transportation costs. I think that I could say commensurate increase in food prices and transportation costs. I'm not actually even very familiar with that word, but
concomitant.
Don't you think commensurate would have worked? Like, hey,
I don't.
Other stuff.
Well, I'm gonna be honest with you that, like, I haven't read that in a book and then had to Google it and then, like, use it in a sentence or a tweet or like a Discord like chat. So I don't know what that was.
So
that's why I add those $15 words.
Yeah. Here's another example of IMF structural adjustment programs having absolutely coercive effects on an economy, causing things like oil, food, and public transportation to dramatically rise to the point where people are protesting and rioting. And, the very metrics that you're hoping to alleviate are becoming exacerbated, and people end up taking to the streets because they can't live there. They have to have one meal per day.
Right. That one meal of like less than 1,000 calories or something from like the first chapter. Right. So it's like
it went to 1,600, which is still dramatically low.
Right.
And then let's go here.
They won't be able to riot if they're only getting less than 2,000 calories a day.
Kenya, in protests of IMF demands, reverses economic changes. And this is by the Washington Post too. Kenya's economy was thrown into confusion today as Daniel Arap Moi set in motion a dramatic about-face from his government's recent economic restructuring by rejecting it as unrealistic, tough austerity measures demanded by the IMF. A number of African leaders complained bitterly about IMF-imposed austerity measures being too tough, too politically unpopular, or too intrusive. But with the countries in economic freefall, most leaders have combined their rhetorical condemnation with pragmatism, swallowing the changes they.
I don't think it's rhetorical.
Or to obtain loans. Few countries in Act for Oil have specifically opted out of structural adjustment programs, and those that have, such as Nigeria and India, have ended up imposing their own brand of painful austerity. Where is the... Last month's revisions resulted in 65% devaluation of local currency and whopping price hikes on most basic commodities because transportation costs and the price of most commodities are determined by the price of fuel, which is imported and must be paid for in hard currency. Leaders of the foreign dark ages. So that's Kenya. All right. Okay, so now a quote from Jason Hickel. Every one of today's rich countries developed its economy through protectionist measures. So this is just referring to all of the glorious examples of economic development and freedom and democracy did not do this through the methods that are being prescribed by these institutions in the third world. Every one of today's rich countries developed its economy through protectionist measures. In fact, until recently, the United States and Britain were the two most aggressively protectionist countries in the world. They built their economic power using government subsidies, trade tariffs, restricted patents, everything that the neoliberal playbook denounces today. Structural adjustment allowed the West to kick away the ladder that they had used to climb the heights of development, ensuring that no one else would be able to follow. The development narrative has it wrong. It is not that poor countries have been unable to climb the development ladder. It is that they have been specifically precluded from doing so. And I think that that's one of the most concise summarizations of what this chapter is describing, is that this isn't an inability to climb the ladder. It's that you've been specifically restricted from access to the ladder.
Right. And I just want to end like this on this before we move on to the next part. He quotes Davidson Budhu, a native of Grenada, resigned with a lengthy letter addressed to his former employer, IMF managing director Michael Camdesis, who wrote, "Today, I resigned from the staff of the International Monetary Fund after over 12 years and after 1,000 days of official fund work in the field. Hawking your medicine and your bag of tricks to governments and to people in Latin America and the Caribbean and Africa? To me, resignation is a priceless liberation, for with it, I have taken the first big step to that place where I may hope to wash my hands of what in my mind's eye is the blood of millions of poor and starving people. Mr. Camdesis, the blood is so much, it runs in rivers. It dries up too. It cakes all over me. Sometimes I feel that there is not enough soap in the whole world to cleanse me from the things I did do in your name, in the names of your predecessors, and under your official seal."
Next time you get that, maybe move away from your mic just a little bit, because there was a little
popping hard.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to get the effect down. I don't know. Whatever.
No,
Fuck it.
Absolutely.
Fuck me for trying to be a little bit of a thespian about it, but I just imagine him just dropping the mic or walking away after saying that.
I mean, it was it's poetic in a sense. It's amazing that this individual walked away from it and was able to so poetically talk about the rivers of blood that cake on him, that there's not enough soap to remove from his body, and
you can find videos of him talking too.
Yeah, that's just one example of a defector, let's say, of the IMF and the World Bank coming forward and stating how toxic and corrosive their policies are. You can also find this in Joseph Stiglitz, who I know is actually a pretty popular economic voice in contemporary discussion. He is a defector of the World Bank. He was a chief economist of the World Bank, who now decries their methodology. There's William Esterly, who also worked for, I believe, the IMF. It's really the whole point. We can all learn the details to make it so, but the conclusion one should make is that the periphery is precluded. That's really the difference between dialectical analysis and a liberal one. Absolutely. Yeah, the liberal one is the same way that it's applied to individual people within the economy, saying that anyone can be Elon Musk or anyone can be Jeff Bezos if they're just if they just pull themselves up by their bootstraps and they work hard and save their pennies and they don't go to Starbucks
and they're born in the right family with the right amount of money.
Jokes that you hear that are levied for individuals that remove the responsibility of poverty from any type of a responsibility is the same exact rationalization that is used to justify the poverty of nations, and it lacks any context of like circumstantial context, just like you stated. So thank you, Sam. Before moving on from that, I did have a couple last things that I wanted to talk about in terms of the IMF and the World Bank. The United States of America holds 16% of shares in both institutions, both the World Bank and the IMF, which effectively grants them de facto veto power. Next in line is France, the United Kingdom, Germany, and Japan, which are all members of the G7 that we discussed in the beginning of the stream. The Global South accounts for 85% of the world population, yet only accounts for 40% of the vote of the IMF and the World Bank, meaning that if every country of the Global South united in a vote, it could still be undermined by imperial core countries, even just the United States. The World Bank president has always been American, and the IMF president has always been European. So even if there was like some kind of like a recognition of there is a recognition of it, but even if it was formalized and brought to the table and voted on, there is still, even in a completely unified 100% agreement vote of Global South countries, still would not be able to unseat or veto the power of the United States and its Western affiliates.
Oh wait, are we on what the hell is it? The ironclad part?
No, this was just the end of the other one, but we can move on to capital and iron law now.
Yeah, because they get into the various presidents that have been
we'll get to
the
that.
president of the World Bank. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So capital's iron law, a quote that I have to illustrate this section of the book. In the early 1980s, the G7's goal was to use the World Bank and the IMF to cripple the South's economic revolution and reestablish Western access to its resources and its markets. On this point, they certainly didn't fail. But there was another deeper purpose that the World Bank and the IMF served, and that was to save Western capitalism itself. So this is referring to like the pond that is capitalism's, or economics in general, that you can't let capital sit around and stagnate. There has to be a process of filtration and movement to sustain the ecosystem of an economy.
So you have to maintain the pH, otherwise it'll die.
Yeah. You can have Wall Street, right? And they might have all of this financial, all this capital that they've acquired, but I believe that they said that inflation outpaces interest that is accrued, just putting it into a savings. So you actually lose money in the long run holding on to large sums of money. So it has to go somewhere. We have to put it to something so we can capitalize on the capital, because capital is a commodity at this point. So it has to go into developmental projects. This is a very lucrative way for Wall Street bankers to utilize their massive amounts of funds in an almost, like you were saying before, you can't even go bankrupt on it. It's enforced by like a international conglomeration of the most powerful nations in the world. You can't get out from under it. And we're going to talk more about that in a little bit. But so these are extremely safe and lucrative investments for the most nefarious businessmen in the world, or business conglomerates in the world, to invest their many, many millions and billions of dollars into. So essentially, the debt of the third world is auctioned off to Wall Street to further accentuate their already gross profits.
Right. I mean, he talks about like the various limits, right, that like capitalism, Western capitalism runs itself into: the market saturation limit. When consumers have more than they need, buying slows down, businesses can't turn over as many products, right? The ecological depletion limit: when natural resources run low, the cost of essential inputs begin to rise. The class conflict limit, as workers bargain for higher wages and the cost of labor becomes more expensive. And if you deny their demands, or indeed if you try to push wages down to increase your profits, you risk sparking social instability, like the IMF riots that we saw, and
or the Great Depression even.
What's that?
Or even the Great Depression, like the
Great Depression for that matter. And he goes on to say that they can't just put it into savings because interest rates on savings accounts are typically lower than inflation. And that means losing money. and that's why they can't devalue or that's why they have to devalue their currency, right? This is what economists call a crisis of overaccumulation. Overaccumulation, capital begins to lose its value, and this cannot be allowed to happen. Now remember, right, as all these billions and trillions of dollars are just being like sucked right out of the third world, right? Africa, Asia, South America, Latin America, right? The Caribbean, all across the world, right? How many decades have we heard, every time something like student debt relief or like socialized healthcare or like, fucking, I don't know, public infrastructure, just like, public transportation, any of this stuff. How many times have you heard, well, and who's going to pay for it?
Yeah.
How are we going to pay for that? It's just like, are you fucking kidding me?
I mean, and it's like you could like probably shave like a quarter off of our military budget and fund almost like the entirety of.
You get rid of homelessness like entirely domestically.
I have no figures in front of me, but like with what we spend in military, if you halved that, not even though it should be like completely abolished, almost completely abolished, aside from like some domestic defense. You could probably fund a worldwide social program to end hunger and end homelessness in the world, I would assume, on the United States military budget.
With like a 16th of the military budget, you could probably like turn America into like a functioning like social democracy overnight. I'm not even fucking kidding. Like,
that's what I mean. And there's no problem in this function in this social democratic taxation and resource allocation, wealth redistribution if it's going to military contractors. There's no question of where's that money going to come from.
Oh, it's murdering people.
Yeah.
And it will even under that social democracy, like we said, it's like a 16th, a quarter of like the military budget to do all that, and we would still probably be doing this, even as that hypothetical social democracy would still probably be like murdering.
France is sitting right next to us in all this.
Yeah,
you know what I mean. Like France has some good social programs going on. That doesn't mean that they stop being like a neo-colonial geopolitical menace.
Oh shit! Did I send you that video of like how France like maintains all of its shit?
Was it in the playlist? Is that what you're saying?
No, I think I may have been from the last one. Let me see if I can pull it up.
All right. Well, I just wanted to bring up. So, in this sense that we're bringing up now, that we're looking at a highly profitable commodity, which is third world debt. Structural adjustment turned out to be highly profitable for Western corporations. U.S. investments abroad grew to more than 10 trillion, and income from those investments increased from about 20% of domestic profits in the late 1970s to about 80% by the end of the 1980s. I'm sorry, I think I read that wrong. U.S. investments abroad grew to more than 10 trillion, and income from those investments increased from about 20% of domestic profits in the late 1970s to about 80% by the end of the 1980s. What is more, American companies began to enjoy an increasing rate of return on those investments during the structural adjustment period, up from 5% in 75 to over 11% in 1990. The World Bank alone privatized more than 2 trillion of its assets in developing countries between 1984 and 2012. That amounts to an average of 72 billion per year of profitable opportunities for Western investors, in addition to the 58 billion of high interest bonds that the bank sells on Wall Street each year. So this is a major business. Like, this isn't even just like it boggles the mind that in this climate of everything is a commodity, nothing is off the table. Everything has a perverse profit motive attached to it. Even the debt that is being sold from third world countries. Oh, the Caspian report. I love this channel. When I was doing my research for the video on Korea, I used this channel quite a bit.
I can never tell like where they fall like on the spectrum, so to speak.
I think they're pretty apolitical, at least from the way that I like. So this is 11 minutes long. Is there anything that you particularly wanted from here? Or?
You know what? Nah, we can skip it because I think that like we've gone over it like pretty hard. But like
I'm gonna put it in the chat. If anybody wants to watch a video of how France maintains its grip on Africa,
right. And for everybody in chat, right, or anybody watching this, right, or anybody in the future, I guess, if you join our Discord, like there's a lot of videos that we don't wind up like using, but like are like good peripheral information for a lot of the stuff that we cover. If you go into our Discord, there's a whole channel with like the videos that didn't wind up making the cut that like, we post in a certain part of the Discord, and you can check them out if you want.
Right.
But also, I sent you a link to that Instagram post because of the shooter from yesterday, and I love looking at his pummeled fucking face.
Well, let's do it at the end of the stream. Let's just pull this up so we don't divert. But I'll definitely bring that up. I promise. Remind me. So, back to this concept of privatization at the behest of the IMF and the World Bank. We revisit Bolivia. In the mid-1990s, the World Bank pressured the government of Bolivia to privatize the water supply of the city of Cochabamba. The contract went to Bechtel, an American corporation. Okay, that's the point that I wanted to make here, is that not only are we selling the debt to Wall Street, but also there's American products and contractors that are tied up, just like with the military. Just like with the military-industrial complex, where the resources for the military are contracted through the state or through the Fed to private contractors that are now reaping massive profits off of our war. A lot of times, like, just completely erroneously too. Like, I don't know if you've heard about, like, because they're government contracts, they just jack up like the prices of these like menial parts that only cost several dollars to make, but they charge hundreds of dollars.
What do you mean, like the $12,000 toilets? Exactly. for like bases and shit. I know what you're talking about.
Exactly, because taxpayers are paying for it. Yeah. It doesn't matter. You know what I mean? Like, there's these lucrative contracts that can be garnished through the U.S. government or through the IMF and the World Bank in this sense, that you can do these development projects, and a private entity can gouge the prices immensely. So in the mid-1990s, the World Bank pressured the government of Bolivia to privatize the water supply in the city of Cochabamba. The contract went to Bechtel, an American corporation, which raised the price of water by 35%. Unable to afford this most basic resource in 2000, the people of Cochabamba erupted in protests that became a worldwide symbol of resistance against privatization. But the World Bank continued to stand by their policy. As late as 2008, a leading bank official was asked to explain why the bank supports water privatization. Why would you support water privatization when it's going to raise the cost of water 35% for desperately poor people, despite mounting evidence that it hurts the poor? He replied by stating, "We believe that providing clean water and sanitation services is a real business opportunity."
I have like a 5-minute video if you want to play it on that too.
Sure, absolutely. It seems like a good time for that. You know who was in the protests against this? I'll give you one.
I'm going to go out. I'm going to take a wild stab at the dark.
Correct. Fidel Castro and Cuban agents.
Nah. Well, what are you talking about? My boy Evo wasn't out there?
He was there. He was out there. Well, also, I had a link to about Cochabamba actually had a dam built that Evo actually spearheaded, and now they actually have water.
Nice.
Not because of privatization, but because of Evo Morales' nationalistic, Marxist-inspired development program. So
his satanic indigenous
the drug cartel that he
will have no access to fresh drinking water by 2025 has provoked the initial confrontations in a worldwide battle for control over the planet's most basic resource. When Bolivia sought to refinance the public water service of its third largest city, the World Bank required that it be privatized, which is how the Bechtel Corporation of San Francisco gained control over all of Cochabamba's water. even that which fell from the sky.
Estas leyes de contrato prohibían a la gente acumular el agua de la lluvia. Por lo tanto, el agua de la lluvia también se privatizaba. La factura de agua le daba un valor legal a la empresa para que pueda apropiarse de su propiedad, de su vivienda, rematando la misma. La gente debía optar por una decisión de comer menos, pagar del agua, pagar por los servicios básicos, dejar de mandar a los niños a la escuela, no asistir a los hospitales y curarse en la propia casa, o en todo caso, gente jubilada, por ejemplo, que tiene una renta muy, muy baja, debería buscar trabajo en las calles. Con la consigna de el agua es nuestra, carajo, la gente sale a las calles, sale a los caminos y protesta.
The price this beleaguered country paid for World Bank loans was the privatization of the state oil industry and its airline, railroad, electric, and phone companies. But the government failed to convince Bolivians that water is a commodity like any other.
Entonces, ahí sí vimos que el gobierno defendía los intereses de la transnacional Vitel, porque la gente quería agua, no gases. La gente quería justicia y no balas.
Estas son las imágenes que reflejan definitivamente la situación que vivió Cochabamba durante la jornada de este viernes. Prácticamente estuvo sitiada.
Bolivia was determined to defend the corporation's right to charge families living on $2 a day, as much as 1/4 of their income for water. The greater the popular resistance to the water privatization scheme, the more violent became the standoff.
Y por eso hubieron centenares de heridos jóvenes que a sus 16, 17 años perdieron brazos, perdieron piernas, quedaron paralíticos, quedaron lesionados de la cabeza de por vida y murió Víctor Hugo Daza.
Transnational corporations have a long and dark history of condoning tyrannical governments. Is it narcissism that compels them to seek their reflection in the regimented structures of fascist regimes?
There was an interesting connection between the rise of fascism in Europe and the consciousness of politically radical people about corporate power, because there was a recognition that fascism rose in Europe with the help of enormous corporations.
Mussolini was greatly admired all across the spectrum. Business loved him. Investment shot up. And suddenly when Hitler came in Germany, the same thing happened there. Investment shot up in Germany. He had the workforce under control. He was getting rid of dangerous left-wing elements. Investment opportunities were improving. There was no problems. These are wonderful countries.
That's a great video to illustrate that. Thank you.
Yeah, and for anybody that, like, you know, remembers when Evo was overthrown, this was a man that, like, you know, constitutionally, like, put, you know, Mother Earth, like, and representation in the Constitution. This is a man that, like, had, like, a booming middle class. This was a man that, like, you know, was one of the first indigenous elected representatives, like, you know, in the continent. And, like, you know, for anybody to at that time try and say that, like, he can't be that popular. No, he fucking was. Like, look at like what the fuck people dealt with for decades at a time. And you're gonna tell me that, like, he's not popular enough to, like, he should still be in office, in my opinion. That man should have fucking, like, served for fucking life if he could.
Maybe. Shout out to Evo, though, spiritual advisor of the podcast. So moving forward in this concept of privatization, when we look at it through this lens, it makes sense that all of the World Bank's past presidents have not been developmental experts. You would think that if their stated goal was to develop third world nations and end poverty and reduce hunger, that they would probably have some like developmental experts as their president, correct? Wouldn't logic suggest that?
You would think.
But rather, U.S. Army bosses and Wall Street executives, people who have a strategic interest in America's role in the global economic system, were the ones who assumed the presidency of the World Bank and the IMF. Here they are, in order of appearance: Eugene Meyer, who is chairman of the Federal Reserve; John McCloy, who was a U.S. Assistant Secretary of War; Eugene Black, who was a bank executive with Chase; George Woods, who was bank executive with First Boston Corporation; Robert McNamara, U.S. Secretary of Defense and executive of Ford Motor Company; Alden Clausen, who was a bank executive with Bank of America; Barbara Conable, who was U.S. Congresswoman; Lewis Preston, who was a bank executive with J.P. Morgan; and James Wolfenson, corporate lawyer and banker Paul Wolfowitz, who was Paul Wolfowitz, who was U.S. Deputy Secretary of Defense; Robert Zoellick, who was Deputy Secretary of State and U.S. Trade Representative.
Also, Paul Wolfowitz was the U.S. ambassador to Indonesia.
So those are the individuals that are responsible for presiding over the World Bank.
Right. And it would be followed up with Obama's pick of Korean-American physician and anthropologist, co-founders of Partners in Health and president of Dartmouth College, Jim Yong Kim, right, from 2012 to 2019. And in 2019, Trump picked David Malpass, who was the chief economist at Bear Stearns, and historically does not make sound financial decisions or advice, especially when it comes to the financial crash of 2007, and if housing is at all important to American people. We can look into that, like, another time maybe, but like it's also kind of funny that, like, you would think Biden would like pick a new guy, right? It kind of seems like they just get to like pick whoever the hell they want and replace it, but like still hasn't. David Malpass is still the president of the World Bank. So it kind of makes it seem like, is he really doing anything that wrong or that bad that like Biden disagrees with? So
right. So this leads us to the next subchapter, which is called the inequality machine, which is a reference to the fact that these policies that are recommended by the World Bank and the IMF are so deterministically harmful to equality that you could almost describe them as a mechanized process of creating inequality. To illustrate that, in 1960, the richest fifth of the world's population earned 30 times more than the poorest fifth. This is according to the United Nations Human Development Report. By 1995, they earned 74 times more. So that's an over 100% increase in the income distribution from 1960 to 1995. Right. That's how extreme that this level of inequality is becoming over the periods of these proposed alleviating policies.
You want to know what would actually be like alleviating? If developing countries would
go on.
If developing countries would have been earning the 2.66 trillion with a T more each year for their exports had their labor been paid fairly on the world market. Look at that fucking graph. It's literally,
this is the United States, and this is everybody else.
The rest of the fucking world.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think it's lost on a lot of people that, like, you know, oh, it's just Asia, Africa, or whatever. Like, you know, at least 25% of like the world population like lives in and it doesn't. We're like literally a global minority. Like a majority of the world lives in Africa and Asia.
Mm-hmm. So to quantify this a little bit, in the 1960s, developing countries were losing $161 billion in 2015 dollars each year through what economists call unequal exchange, which is the conceptual basis of a lot of this book, which is the difference between the real value of goods that a developing country exports and the market prices that they get for those goods. That there has been an unequal precedent that has been established with third world countries in terms of what their materials are worth and what their labels worth versus what it actually should be if it was applied to like a global market standard. And thus, altogether, since the debt crisis began in 1980, the South has handed over a total of $4.2 trillion in interest payments to foreign creditors, mostly in the North. If we include payments on principal, we see that developing countries made total debt service payments of $238 billion per year during the 1980s, rising dramatically through the 1990s to $444 billion per year in the year 2000, and then to more than $732 billion per year in 2013. Altogether, during the whole period since 1980, the South has made debt service payments totaling $13 trillion. Lebanon, for instance, spends 52% of its budget on debt service and only 23% on health and education combined. So in Lebanon, you have 52 over half of your half of your national budget going to debt repayment, and only 23% on health and education combined.
Oh, and then the Lebanese economy fucking crashed like what, 2 years ago? 3 years ago? I think it was like during COVID, like the Lebanese economy, like nobody could take their money like out of their bank account because they had invested it like into like US dollars. You know, and there was this part of the book that like really I think should have been in this section, but he says like by turning poor countries into new frontiers for investment, extraction, and accumulation, they allow Western capitalism to surmount its limits and carry on without having to confront its own internal contradictions, at least for the time being. It's not a real solution to the crisis, of course. It's just a way of moving the crisis around geographically. But without it, capitalism in the United States and Europe would have crashed up against market saturation, ecological depletion, and class conflict long ago, and may well have collapsed. This is why the World Bank and the IMF are so valued by the US government and Wall Street. They are essential to the continuity of the system. And I can't help but look at these graphs and say that, like, yeah, like we would have been like a just husk of you know what was once an entire civilization decades ago. I mean, look at the UK. Look, ever since it exited fucking, you know, what the fuck is it? The European Union. It's had nothing but dysfunction.
Yep.
And we don't know how to play nice with other countries, and we're paying for it.
So we can see here the amount that the Global South contributes to foreign debt service. And the interesting thing about that number is that the amount that the Global South spends collectively on debt service each year vastly outstrips the amount that the UN tells us is necessary to eradicate poverty entirely. You could cancel all debt payments and cancel global poverty in the same swoop. So, like, saying that your aim is to alleviate poverty while also imposing insurmountable debt and structural adjustment handicaps upon a nation is a counterintuitive measure. These are not policies that will alleviate poverty. They only will increase poverty. And we can see that. We've seen that exemplified over and over and over. Like, we are beating a dead horse at this point in terms of like how we've offered statistics from almost every angle that you could look at this and try to find where is the nugget of beneficial benefit that has come of all this. I mean, and unless you're like a banker in Wall Street or someone of that ilk, I think that's like a perennial thing. Doesn't he say ilk a lot?
Yeah, ilk.
Of that ilk.
Ilk.
You're not seeing any of that benefit. And a majority of the world is seeing an actual significant detriment because of this this dynamic playing out.
And like Sam
one final,
said,
go ahead.
these are just the conservative end of the estimates. It could be worse than this.
One final point to bear in mind. Despite the imposition of dozens of structural adjustment programs across the global south, which, remember, we intended to reduce debt, debt stocks have not reduced much at all. In fact, they have increased. External debt as a percentage of gross national income in the global south was 25% in 1980 when the debt crisis struck. So this is that time when the debt crisis struck that we were talking about before. Like, oh, there's debt crisis. We need to fix this. At the end of the first decade of structural adjustment, it was up to 38%. That's 13%. It has increased debt from the debt crisis. The debt crisis has not been alleviated through these loans. By the end of the second decade, it was 39%. In other words, structural adjustment failed even on its own punitive terms. The remedy prescribed for the debt crisis beginning in the 1980s made the disease worse.
Well, it's almost as if,
like, even now, like so we've demonstrated this in so many different ways of how like this like process of debt imposition and structural adjustment has handicapped nations, have made them like worse in almost every metric. There's been no benefit. It hasn't even alleviated the fucking debt. It hasn't even put a dent in the debt. It's only increased the debt.
It's almost as if it's not designed to alleviate debt.
How do you justify this? How does this continue to be justified?
I mean, you would think that, like, if like the U.S. had like socialized healthcare, you know, like I was saying before, if we had like good public transportation and like, you know, good healthcare and like, you know, good infrastructure, you know, just any of the things that were on Bernie's platform, if we had just like half of them, not even all of them, you know, somebody could make the argument, well, if we don't do this, you know, then we won't be able to afford any of this other stuff. And it's like, maybe, you know, if you're dumb enough, you can like believe that argument. But it's like, what do we even have to show for it? Like, how much of fucking the US population like lives in near abject fucking poverty?
Yeah, I mean, compared to less than in other countries, for sure.
Like,
but
you would, yes, it's less severe in other countries, but you can't tell me that, like, you know, looking at like the domestic tensions of the U.S., especially in the last like 10 years, right?
Yeah, and I live in Philadelphia, and in Philadelphia you can find poverty that is bordering third world levels.
Yeah,
for sure.
Just go down to Kensington. It's just like.
Yeah. I mean, you want to look at third world-esque poverty. I mean, I've also visited the third world a few times, and you know, I've never seen worse poverty than when I was in India. That was like another dimension of poverty that I'd never experienced, even in my visits through like several places in like Central and South America. But what I experienced in India was like definitely like just, I don't even know how to explain it, how it brought me out.
Breathless, you know, it's indescribable.
With no shoes and no pants on, just completely exposed genitals, walking around piles of trash as they're herding like a goat around, and the goat is just grazing on the trash. And like if you're in traffic, there's families that live on the corner, and like they send like the little girls, like these emaciated little girls, over to you holding a baby, because like they bring you the baby so that you can see like they give the little girl the baby, and they come up holding the baby to you while you're in the car to essentially be like, look, and they point to the shoes and say, we don't have shoes, and they're like, look, and it's like, I've never. It's the most intense poverty that, and India is doing relatively well too. If you look at it in like the aggregate, you know what I mean? Like compared to a lot of countries, India is doing relatively well. But in terms
yes, Sam, he has. Pat has like zero problem just buying a fucking plane ticket and just going someplace. He's not even multilingual. All right, Pat, do you speak any Spanish?
Yeah.
How much?
I've taken lessons. I mean, like I can get around the city a little bit.
Pat is fearless.
Yeah. So this brings us to our last section, which is called the hidden power of debt. And this section kind of like centers around a question. And that question is, if this process of debt imposition is so coercive to the global South economy, then why don't they just refuse to pay it?
Why don't they?
Isn't that like a thing? It's like, hey, why can't they be like, hey, we're going to opt out of this. This was done by other administrations that we didn't even vote into power, and now we're suffering. We can't eat. We can't afford gasoline because of this. We're just going to opt out on that. What would you say the answer to that is?
We're just gonna back out.
The answer to that question is why they can't just do that is Thomas Sankara.
One day I'll get like a little like stream deck and we can do fun shit like that. But
yeah, we should definitely get a buzzer for. So, as we have frequently done, evoked the legacy of our maybe most significant spiritual advisor, Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso, we will be ending the stream today also in reverence of the upright man. For those that don't know, Thomas Sankara was elected president of Burkina Faso, which was at that time Upper Volta, which was a colonial name bestowed upon the region by France. He changed the name to Burkina Faso, which translates to the name of the land of upright men. Mr. Sankara remained in power. Comrade Sankara remained in power for 4 short years, but in this time, he accomplished massive social development programs with no help from the IMF or the World Bank. He vaccinated over 2 million children against easily curable diseases like measles, and I'm actually not reading this off anything. I just know this offhand. I forget what the other few were. He instituted land reform. He what were some of the other things that he did? He cut the spending of government officials. He sold off a fleet of, I believe, Mercedes-Benz that were given to all people. He would not fly first class. Food sovereignty. Oh, that's it. Duh. Yeah. Food sovereignty. Make it.
He only wanted seeds. No food.
Yeah. Planting. He planted he reforested a significant amount of it.
I think he also ended, what is it, child bride shit,
child bride, genital mutilation.
That's another one. He got rid of the patriarchal polygamy.
There was tribal politics that dominated the region that he kind of took a lot of the power away from, these tribal chieftains, or I'm sorry, that might be a totally
it gets a little murky there,
Well, they definitely had the tribal thing is true for sure, that there was tribal power that circumvented national power in many areas, and he removed that power in many circumstances.
Right. Because I still think that indigenous, sovereignty should still be respected, even while, you're doing all these other positive things for, marginalized communities within your country.
Well, yeah, I mean, but this is a weird question, and maybe you can answer this for me. Would Thomas Sankara and his affiliates not be considered indigenous to that area?
Yeah, I'm sure they would be considered indigenous to that area. I'm just saying that,
it seems different if it's like an intra-indigenous dispute between the progressive and the more traditional aspects of that society. That when it's like an imposition of like an out group that is coming in and trying to destroy traditional ways of living. I think if it's like, if you take like an indigenous, two varying communities of the indigenous population and they have a disagreement, I mean, I think that's a little bit different than like just like going into an indigenous zone as someone from an out group and being like no more.
I think it also, requires a lot more analysis on what is that indigenous culture, and is he a practitioner of that? You know what I'm saying?
Right. Well,
that, but also if you're abolishing parts of the culture, that's where things get a little bit okay, this is gonna take some nuance here. You know what I mean?
Right.
And I have not studied that nuance, right, for what those particular parts of that culture that were up for the chopping block, and it's not up to me to decide whether that was a good or a bad thing. But I do think that as far as trying to make the standard of living for non-men within the country better, it's an overall positive no matter what.
Well, look at the Soviet Union. The eastern Soviet Union states like Uzbekistan and the surrounding areas. There was a lot of people, Uzbeks, in that area who were very much in favor of the Soviet policy of rooting out some of the more what's the word that I'm looking for? Harmful religious practices that dominated it, such as child brides, such as the imposition of the hijab and things like that. And there was many women and men in that society that did not want that to occur anymore. But there was also many traditional elements that wanted to keep those laws, and it was a source of antagonism. So you have to look at it. You are walking the line between cultural chauvinism and progressivism, I think there's definitely ways that can be done unethically, and also ways that needs to happen ethically in the most ethical way possible.
I think that before we get too more sidetracked about this, I think that Thomas Sankara is, along with Kwame Nkrumah, a very excellent example of how to walk that line, right? And I feel like, Thomas Sankara wasn't given the opportunity to pursue that path of political development,
Well, I'd say Evo Morales also. I mean, I don't know if anyone has walked the line of indigenous cultural retention and political progressivism better than Evo Morales in his time. And you could probably speak to the broader mass movement, because I know that they're still in power in Bolivia, even though that it's not Morales directly, but I'm sure that just from my Western perspective, where I know Evo so well, but don't know many of the other constituents, there's probably many other people that are carrying that banner of MAS and indigenous plurinationalism along with political and socialist progressivism. So we can find examples of this certainly, and I'm sure that there's a lot that you could look at in Afghanistan that exemplify that fissure between the progressive elements and the traditional
between the Pashtun and the the Afghani Maoists. There's a lot there that we can get to later on. During
that's a whole discussion, and it's a great. It's actually a very entertaining discussion, which actually is a little sad because a lot of times we're following this strict regiment of reiterating these chapters, and it kind of hampers us having these kind of just spirited off the cuff discussions. But we'll talk about that on the back end. I have a video here of our spiritual advisor Thomas Sankara speaking about debt to the Western world and how it should be handled.
Nous estimons que la dette s'analyse d'abord de par ses origines. Les origines de la dette remontent aux origines du colonialisme. Ceux qui nous ont prêté de l'argent, ce sont ceux-là qui nous ont colonisés. Ce sont les mêmes qui géraient nos États et nos économies. Ce sont les colonisateurs qui endettaient l'Afrique auprès des bailleurs de fonds, leurs frères et cousins. Nous étions étrangers à cette dette. Nous ne pouvons donc pas la payer. La dette, c'est encore le néocolonialisme où les colonisateurs se sont transformés en assistants techniques. En fait, nous devrions dire qu'ils se sont transformés en assassins techniques. Et ce sont eux qui nous ont proposé des sources de financement, des bailleurs de fonds internes que l'on emploie chaque jour, comme s'il y avait des hommes dont le bâillement suffisait à créer le développement chez les autres. Ces bailleurs de fonds nous ont été conseillés, recommandés. On nous a présenté des montages financiers alléchants, des dossiers. Nous nous sommes endettés pour 50 ans, 60 ans, même plus. C'est-à-dire que l'on nous a amenés à compromettre le peuple pendant 50 ans et plus. Mais la dette, c'est sa forme actuelle. Contrôlée, dominée par l'impérialisme. Une reconquête savamment organisée pour que l'Afrique, sa croissance, son développement obéissent à des paliers, à des normes qui nous sont totalement étrangères, faisant en sorte que chacun de nous devienne l'esclave financier, c'est-à-dire l'esclave tout court, de ceux qui ont eu l'opportunité, la ruse, la fourberie de placer les fonds chez nous avec l'obligation de rembourser. On nous dit de rembourser la dette. Ce n'est pas une question morale. Ce n'est pas une question de ce prétendu honneur que de rembourser ou de ne pas rembourser. Monsieur le Président, nous avons écouté et applaudi le Premier ministre de Norvège lorsqu'elle est intervenue ici même. Elle a dit, elle qui est européenne, que toute la dette ne peut pas être remboursée. La dette ne peut pas être remboursée. La dette ne peut pas être remboursée parce que, d'abord, si nous ne payons pas, nos bailleurs de fonds ne mourront pas. Soyons-en sûrs. Par contre, si nous payons, c'est nous qui allons mourir. Soyons-en sûrs également. Ceux qui nous ont amenés, ceux qui nous ont conduits à l'endettement, ont joué comme dans un casino. Quand ils gagnaient, il y avait plein de débats. Maintenant qu'ils ont perdu au jeu, ils nous exigent le remboursement. Et on parle de crise. Non, Monsieur le Président, ils ont joué, ils ont perdu, c'est la règle du jeu. La vie continue.
Oh, the game.
Nous ne pouvons pas rembourser la dette parce que nous n'avons pas de quoi payer. Nous ne pouvons pas rembourser la dette parce que nous ne sommes pas responsables de la dette. Nous ne pouvons pas payer la dette parce qu'au contraire, les autres nous doivent ce que les plus grandes richesses ne pourront jamais payer, c'est-à-dire la dette de sang. C'est notre sang qui a été versé. On parle du plan Marshall qui a refait l'Europe économique. Mais on ne parle jamais du plan africain qui a permis à l'Europe de faire face aux hordes hitlériennes lorsque leur économie était menacée, leur stabilité était menacée. Qui a sauvé l'Europe? C'est l'Afrique. On en parle très peu. On en parle si peu que nous ne pouvons pas, nous, être complices de ce silence ingrat. Si les autres ne peuvent pas chanter nos louanges, nous avons au moins le devoir de dire que nos pères furent courageux et que nos anciens combattants ont sauvé l'Europe et finalement ont permis au monde de se débarrasser du nazisme. La dette, c'est aussi la conséquence des affrontements. Et lorsque l'on nous parle aujourd'hui de crise économique, on oublie de nous dire que la crise n'est pas venue de façon subite. La crise existe de tout temps. Et elle ira en s'aggravant chaque fois que les masses populaires seront de plus en plus conscientes de leurs droits face aux exploiteurs. Il y a crise aujourd'hui parce que les masses refusent que les richesses soient concentrées entre les mains de quelques individus. Il y a crise parce que quelques individus déposent dans des banques à l'étranger des sommes colossales qui suffiraient à développer l'Afrique. Il y a crise parce que face à ces richesses individuelles que l'on peut nommer, les masses populaires refusent de vivre dans les ghettos, dans les bas quartiers. Il y a crise parce que les peuples partout refusent d'être dans Soweto face à Johannesburg. Il y a donc lutte, et l'exacerbation de cette lutte amène les tenants du pouvoir financier à s'inquiéter. On nous demande aujourd'hui d'être complices de la recherche d'un équilibre. Équilibre en faveur des tenants du pouvoir financier, équilibre au détriment de nos masses populaires. Non, nous ne pouvons pas être complices. Non, nous ne pouvons pas accompagner ceux qui sucent le sang de nos peuples et qui vivent la sueur de nos peuples. Nous ne pouvons pas les accompagner dans leur démarche assassine. Monsieur le Président, nous entendons parler de clubs. Club de Rome, club de Paris, club de partout. Nous entendons parler du groupe des 5, du groupe des 7, du groupe des 10, peut-être du groupe des 100, et que sais-je encore. Il est normal que nous créions notre club et notre groupe. Faisons en sorte que dès aujourd'hui, Addis Abeba devienne également le siège, le centre d'où partira le souffle nouveau, le club d'Addis Abeba. Nous avons le devoir aujourd'hui de créer le front uni d'Addis Abeba contre la dette. Ce n'est que de cette façon que nous pourrons dire aux autres, en refusant de payer la dette, nous ne venons pas dans une démarche belliqueuse. Au contraire, c'est dans une démarche fraternelle pour dire ce qui est. Du reste, les masses populaires en Europe ne sont pas opposées aux masses populaires en Afrique. Mais ceux qui veulent exploiter l'Afrique, ce sont les mêmes qui exploitent l'Europe. Nous avons une ennemi commun. Donc, notre club parti d'Addis Abeba devra également dire aux uns et aux autres que la dette ne saurait être payée. Et quand nous disons que la dette ne saurait être payée, ce n'est point que nous sommes contre la morale, la dignité, le respect de la parole. Parce que nous estimons que nous n'avons pas la même morale que les autres. Entre le riche et le pauvre, il n'y a pas la même morale. La Bible, le Coran, ne peut pas servir de la même manière celui qui exploite le peuple et celui qui est exploité. Il faudrait alors qu'il y ait 2 éditions de la Bible et 2 éditions du Coran.
Damn.
Nous ne pouvons pas accepter qu'on nous parle de dignité. Nous ne pouvons pas accepter que l'on nous parle de mérite de ceux qui payent et de perte de confiance vis-à-vis de ceux qui ne paieraient pas. Nous devons au contraire dire que c'est normal aujourd'hui. Nous devons au contraire reconnaître que les plus grands voleurs sont les plus riches. Un pauvre, quand il vole, ne commet qu'un larcin ou une peccadille, tout juste pour survivre par nécessité. Les riches, ce sont eux qui volent le fisc, les douanes et qui exploitent le peuple. Monsieur le Président, ma proposition ne vise pas simplement à provoquer ou à faire du spectacle. Je voudrais dire ce que chacun de nous pense et souhaite. Qui ici ne souhaite pas que la dette soit purement simplement effacée? Celui qui ne le souhaite pas, il peut sortir, prendre son avion et aller tout de suite à la Banque mondiale payer.
God damn. God.
Man, that was actually crazy to listen to after.
Oh shit!
Because it's like he almost summarized that whole chapter just in that speech that he gave after just 4 years of being in power. Like it's really intense to hear him go through all those things. That is so like just on point with the whole thing. He was murdered shortly after that. For anybody that's listening that doesn't know, he was assassinated in a violent coup that was believed to be backed by the French government, and the individual that deposed him, Blaise Compaoré, immediately renewed the agreements to pay back the country's debts immediately after that. And Burkina Faso is now like, I think, literally the most troubled nation in the world. I think like in almost every like major metric that makes a country like dangerous and impoverished, I think Burkina Faso is like top 5 in pretty much any list that you look.
There's like an active conflict going on right now, I think.
Yeah, it's fucking horrible. Also, there's Canadian mining companies there that are like certainly that are there for the minerals. So luckily they haven't been deterred. Thank goodness.
Those good, kind, Canadians, they never do anything wrong.
Yeah, no. But I think that brings us to the conclusion of today's stream. Thanks everybody for being here.
Can you throw up that picture real quick?
Oh,
just because we talked
thank you so
about
much
it
for
yesterday.
reminding me. I apologize.
No, you're good. Don't worry about it.
Thanks, Dorian. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Dorian. And yes, Libya is on that list. We can talk about it next chapter. Please remind me.
Or maybe we can read Slouching Towards Sirte, a great book regarding NATO and Libya. Maybe one day down the line. Libya.
If you can just enlarge in that picture. That is the piece of shit that shot up the Q Club a couple days ago, right? And I want that picture. I want that picture to happen to everybody like him. And I know we don't really talk too much about like current events, right? We did we did go over it at the beginning of last stream, and I wanted to make sure that like we put this picture up there, and also to amend what I said last time. It was still like not confirmed about like who got the gun away from this piece of shit. It was a retired vet and a woman that kicked him repeatedly with stiletto heels. Good. Never bring a stiletto to a fight. Never bring a gun to a stiletto fight. And now like he's trying to say that like I think to try and dodge the hate crime charges that he is going to receive, he's trying to say that he is non-binary, and I don't believe that for a fucking second. I believe if anything this is just going to fuel ghouls like Matt Walsh into saying that like see they're those people are they need to be locked up, they're unwell, they're mentally unwell, blah 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 blah. And I don't think anybody should fall for it. I don't think anybody should even get into an argument about it. Just don't even give him the fucking time of day. We know what his fucking aim was. What were you gonna say, Pat?
Nothing particularly. I was just in agreement and support with what you were saying, and fuck that guy.
No. And yes, Gafar was in the Congo for about 4 or 5 years after Lumumba was killed, but the Congolese fighters he was supporting were called the Patrice Lumumba Battalion. Fucking based.
Thanks for that update. Hey, do you know the comedian Patrice O'Neill?
Yes.
Did you know that his middle name is Lumumba?
I did not know. He passed away too, right?
Yeah, his mother named him after Patrice Lumumba. I'll show you real quick.
And yes, Sam, they
Land
did
on
try
a
to say the same thing about the Orlando shooter, that like, he was closeted or something like that. I don't care, even if he was, whether he was or he wasn't. Produce the movement, Malcolm O'Neill. It's like the last person that like you would expect to.
Patrice Malcolm O'Neill was born in New York. He was named by his mother after Patrice Lumumba, leader of Congolese independence movement and the Republic of Congo's first prime minister, and the American human rights activist Malcolm X.
That's wild.
Yeah. R.I.P. So try to end it on a little bit of a high note there. Appreciate everybody being here. Appreciate all the participation, all the love. I'm exhausted. So, happy whatever holidays that you may choose to celebrate or not celebrate. If I could, I would name my kids after some revolutionaries too. We'll be back on Sunday evening, as we're coming to the conclusion of the divide. So stay tuned, and we'll see you soon. Thank you so much for your continued support.
Stay safe, stay strong. La salam.
Salam.